The Garden of Memories by C. A. Mercer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Garden of Memories by C. A. Mercer. The garden looked dreary and desolate in spite of the afternoon sunshine. The lilac and lavender bushes were past their prime. Their wealth of sweetness had been squandered by riotous offshoots. The wind played among the branches and cast changing sun-flecked shadows on the grass-grown paths narrowed by the encroachment of the box borders that had once lined the way with the stiff precision of troops before a royal progress. The flowers had the air of being overburdened with the monotony of their existence. They could never have had that aspect if they had been only wild flowers, and had never experienced human care and companionship. That made the difference. The gate hung on rusty hinges. It answered with a long drawn out creaking as it was pushed open by a man who had been a stranger to the place for nearly 20 years. Yes, the garden was certainly smaller than it had been pictured by his memory. There had been a time when it had appeared as a domain of extensive proportions, and the wood beyond of marvellous depth and density. He was conscious of a sense of disappointment. The property would scarcely realize as high a price in the market as he had hoped, and it was incumbent upon him to part with it, if he would be released from the narrow circumstances that hemmed him in. He had arranged to meet the lawyer there that afternoon. One of the latter's clients had already made a bid for the estate. The timber, at all events, would add to the value. The house faced southward upon the garden. It was here the man had been brought up by an old great aunt. He guessed later that she had grudged him any of the endearments that death had denied her bestowing upon her own children. Her affections had all been buried before he was born. Besides, he took after the wrong branch of the family. She must have possessed a strong personality. It was difficult to bring to mind that it was no longer an existent force. Every one, from the parson to the servants, had stood a little in awe of her. He remembered the unmoved manner in which she had received the news of the death of a near relative. It had overwhelmed him with a sudden chill, that so she would have received tidings of his own. It had taken all the sunshine in the garden to make him warm again. In the mood that was growing upon him, it would not have much surprised him to find her sitting bolt upright in her carved high-backed chair, as she had sat in the time of his earliest recollections, the thin yellow hands on which the ring stood out folded in her lap. On one occasion she had washed his small hands between hers. The hard lustre of the stones acquired a painful association with the ordeal. The blinds would be partially drawn in the musk-scented parlour to save the carpet from further fading, for there had been a tradition of thrift in the family from the time of its settlement, a tradition that had not been maintained by its latest representative. Like the atmosphere of a dream, the years grew dim and misty between now and the time when summer days were longer and sunnier, and it had been counted to him for righteousness if he had amused himself quietly and not given trouble. A stream that he had once dignified with the name of river formed a boundary between the garden and the wood. Although it had shrunk into shallow insignificance, with much beside, a faint halo of the romance with which he had endued this early scene of his adventures still clung to the spot. As he came to the stream, he saw the reflection of a face in the water, not his own, but that of one much younger. It was so he met the boy. The child had been placing stepping stones to bridge the stream, and now came across, balancing himself on the slippery surfaces to test his work. It was odd that he had remained unobserved until this moment, but that was due to the fact of the water rushes on the brink being as tall as he. The boy's eyes met those of the man with a frank, unclouded gaze. He did not appear astonished. That is the way when one is young enough to be continually viewing fresh wonders. One takes everything for granted. He saw at a glance that this other was not alien to him. His instinct remained almost as true as those of the wild nature around. For his own part, he had an unmistakable air of possession about him. He appeared to belong to the place as much as the hollyhocks and honeysuckle. And yet, how could that be? Probably a child of the caretaker, the man told himself. He had authorized the agent to do what was best about keeping the house in order. He had not noticed what signs it had to show of habitation. Now he saw from the distance that it had not the unoccupied appearance he had expected of it, nor the windows the dark vacant stare of those that no life behind illumines. "Do you live here?" he asked of the boy. "Yes." The boy turned proudly toward the modest gray pile in the manner of introducing it. Forgetting himself in his subject, "It's a very old house. There's a picture over the bureau in the parlor of the man who built it and planted the trees in the wood. Hannah says—" "Hannah?" It was a foolish repetition of the name. Of course there were other Hannahs in the world. The old servant of that name, who had told the man stories in his boyhood, had been dead more years than the child could number. "Yes, don't you know Hannah? She'll come and call me in presently, and then you'll see her. Hannah says the trees, have grown up with the family." He assumed a queer importance, evidently in unconscious mimicry of the one who had repeated the tradition to him. "And that with them the house will stand or fall. Do you think the roots really reach so far?" There was an underlying uneasiness in the tone which it was impossible altogether to disguise. As the other expressed his inability to volunteer an opinion on this point, the boy went on, seeing that his confidences were treated with due respect. "I dug up one myself once. I wished I hadn't afterwards, to make myself a Christmas tree like I'd read about. I just had to hang some old things I had on it. It was only tiny fir, small enough to go in a flower pot, but that night the house shook, and the windows rattled, as if all the trees in the forest were trying to get in. I heard them tapping their boughs ever so angrily against the pane. As soon as it was light, I went out and planted the Christmas tree again. I hadn't meant to keep it out of the ground long. They might have known that." "Have you no playfellows here?" The boy gave a comprehensive glance around. "There are the trees. They are good fellows. I wouldn't part with one of them. It's fine to hear them all clap their hands when we are all jolly together. There are nests in them, too, and squirrels. We see a lot of one another." This statement was not difficult to believe. The Holland overalls bore evident traces of fellowship with mossy trunks. The boy did most of the talking. He had more to tell of the founder of the family, whose portrait hung in the parlor, and how, when he, the child, grew up, he rather thought of writing books, as that same ancestor had done, and making the name great and famous again. He had not decided what kind of books he should write yet. Was it very hard to find words to rhyme if one tried poetry? He was at no pains to hide such fancies and ambitions, of which his kind are generally too sensitive or too ashamed to speak to their elders, and which are as a rule forgotten as soon as outgrown. "Shall we go in the wood now?" said the boy. "It's easy enough to cross over the stepping stones." "Yes, let us go." The man was beginning to see everything through the boy's eyes. The garden was again much as he had remembered it, enclosed in a world of beautiful mystery. Nothing was really altered. What alteration he had imagined had been merely a transitory one in himself. The child had put a warm, eager hand into his. Together they went into the wood, as happy as a pair of truant schoolboys. They might have been friends of long standing. "So this is your enchanted forest," said the man. "Not really enchanted," replied the boy seriously. "I once read of one, but of course it was only in a fairy tale. That one vanished as soon as one spoke the right word. It would be a very wrong word that could make this vanish." He had a way of speaking of the wood as if it were some sacred grove. His companion suddenly felt guilty, not quite knowing why. "Of course some one might cut them down." The boy lowered his voice. It seemed shameful to mention the perpetration of such a deed aloud. "It would be terrible to hear them groan when the axe struck them. The young ones mightn't mind so much, but it would be bad for the grandfather trees who've been here from the beginning. Hannah says one would still hear them wailing on stormy nights." "Even if they had been felled and carted away?" "Yes, even then. Though, to be sure, there would be no one to hear the wailing if it is true that the house must fall too at the same time. But we needn't trouble about that. None of it is likely to happen. You see, if it did, where should I be?" He laughed merrily. This last argument appeared to him to be quite conclusive. Such an important consideration placed the awful contingency quite out of the question, and transformed it into nothing more than a joke. The child's laughter died away as they both stood still to listen. Each thought he had heard his own name called. "It's Hannah," said the boy, and off he raced toward the house, barely saving himself from running into the arms of another person who had turned in at the gate.
"Who was the boy who ran round by the espaliers a minute ago? One would scarcely have judged him to be a child of the caretaker."
The man's heart sank with a dull thud. Something had told him the answer before it came.
"Child?"
The lawyer looked puzzled.
"I did not see one. No children have any business in this garden. Neither is there any caretaker here. The house has been shut up altogether since the old servant you called Hannah died 11 years ago."
They had reached the veranda. The westering sun had faded off the windows. It was easy to see that the house was empty. The shutters were up within, and the panes dark and weather stained. Birds had built their nests undisturbed about the chimney stacks. The hearth stones had long been cold.
"My client is willing to purchase the property on the terms originally proposed," the lawyer was saying. "He contemplates investing in it as a building site. Of course, the timber would have to be felled."
A breeze passed through the tree tops like a shudder. The younger man interposed. "I'm sorry you should have had the trouble of coming here, but I have decided to keep the old place after all, stick and stone. It is not right it should go out of the family. I must pull my affairs together as well as I can without that." The little phantom of his dead boyhood was to suffer no eviction. End of The Garden of Memories by C. A. Mercer. Read by Lars Rolander.
A Lodging for the Night by Robert Louis Stevenson. It was late in November 1456. A snow fell over Paris with rigorous, relentless persistence. Sometimes the wind made a sally and scattered it in flying vortices. Sometimes there was a lull, and flake after flake descended out of the black night air, silent, circuitous, interminable. To poor people looking up under moist eyebrows, it seemed a wonder where it all came from. Master Francis Villon had propounded an alternative that afternoon at a tavern window. Was it only pagan Jupiter plucking geese upon Olympus, or were the holy angels moulting? He was only a poor Master of Arts, he went on, and as the question somewhat touched upon divinity, he durst not venture to conclude. A silly old priest from Montargis, who was among the company, treated the young rascal to a bottle of wine in honour of the jest and the grimaces with which it was accompanied, and swore on his own white beard that he had been just such another irreverent dog when he was Villon's age. The air was raw and pointed, but not far below freezing, and the flakes were large, damp, and adhesive. The whole city was sheeted up. An army might have marched from end to end, and not a footfall given the alarm. If there were any belated birds in heaven, they saw the island like a large white patch, and the bridges like slim white spars on the black ground of the river. High up overhead the snow settled among the tracery of the cathedral towers. Many a niche was drifted full, many a statue wore a long white bonnet on its grotesque or sainted head. The gargoyles had been transformed into great false noses, drooping toward the point. The crockets were like upright pillows swollen on one side. In the intervals of the wind there was a dull sound of dripping about the precincts of the church. The cemetery of St. John had taken its own share of the snow. All the graves were decently covered. Tall white housetops stood around in grave array. Worthy burghers were long ago in bed, benight-capped like their domiciles. There was no light in all the neighbourhood but a little peep from a lamp that hung swinging in the church door, and tossed the shadows to and fro in time to its oscillations. The clock was hard on 10 when the patrol went by with halberds and a lantern, beating their hands, and they saw nothing suspicious about the cemetery of St. John. Yet there was a small house backed up against the cemetery wall which was still awake, and awake to evil purpose in that snoring district. There was not much to betray it from without, only a stream of warm vapour from the chimney top, a patch where the snow melted on the roof, and a few half obliterated footprints at the door. But within, behind the shuttered windows, Master Francis Villon the poet, and some of the thievish crew with whom he consorted, were keeping the night alive and passing round the bottle. A great pile of living embers diffused a strong and ruddy glow from the arched chimney. Before this straddled Dom Nicholas, the Picardy monk, with his skirts picked up and his fat legs bared to the comfortable warmth. His dilated shadow cut the room in half, and the firelight only escaped on either side of his broad person and in a little pool between his outspread feet. His face had the beery, bruised appearance of the continual drinkers. It was covered with a network of congested veins, purple in ordinary circumstances, but now pale violet, for even with his back to the fire the cold pinched him on the other side. His cowl had half fallen back and made a strange excrescence on either side of his bull neck. So he straddled, grumbling, and cut the room in half with the shadow of his portly frame. On the right, Villon and Guy Tabary were huddled together over a scrap of parchment, Villon making a ballad which he was to call the Ballad of Roast Fish, and Tabary spluttering admiration at his shoulder. The poet was a rag of a man, dark, little, and lean, with hollow cheeks and thin black locks. He carried his 24 years with feverish animation. Greed had made folds about his eyes, evil smiles had puckered his mouth. The wolf and pig struggled together in his face. It was an eloquent, sharp, ugly, earthly countenance. His hands were small and prehensile, with fingers knotted like a cord, and they were continually flickering in front of him in violent and expressive pantomime. As for Tabari, a broad, complacent, admiring imbecility breathed from his squashed nose and slobbering lips. He had become a thief, just as he might have become the most decent of burgesses, by the imperious chance that rules the lives of human geese and human donkeys. At the monk's other hand, Montigny and Thevenin Pensete played a game of chance. About the first there clung some favour of good birth and training, as about a fallen angel, something long, lithe, and courtly in the person, something aquiline and darkling in the face. Thevenin, poor soul, was in great feather. He had done a good stroke of knavery that afternoon in the Faubourg St. Jacques, and all night he had been gaining from Montigny. A flat smile illuminated his face. His bald head shone rosily in a garland of red curls. His little protuberant stomach shook with silent chucklings as he swept in his gains. "Doubles or quits?" said Thevenin. Montigny nodded grimly. "Some may prefer to dine in state," wrote Villon, "on bread and cheese on silver plate, or help me out, Guido." Tabary giggled. "Or parsley on a silver dish," scribbled the poet. The wind was freshening without. It drove the snow before it, and sometimes raised its voice in a victorious whoop, and made sepulchral grumblings in the chimney. The cold was growing sharper as the night went on. Villon, protruding his lips, imitated the gust, with something between a whistle and a groan. It was an eerie, uncomfortable talent of the poet's, much detested by the Picardy monk. "Can't you hear it rattle in the gibbet?" said Villon. "They are all dancing the devil's jig on nothing up there. You may dance, my gallants, but you'll be none the warmer. Whew, what a gust! Down went somebody just now. A medlar the fewer on the three-legged medlar tree. I say, Dom Nicholas, it'll be cold to night on the Saint Denis road?" he asked. Dom Nicholas winked both his big eyes, and seemed to choke upon his Adam's apple. Montfaucon, the great grisly Paris gibbet, stood hard by the Saint Denis road, and the pleasantry touched him on the raw. As for Tabary, he laughed immoderately over the medlars. He had never heard anything more light-hearted, and he held his sides and crowed. Villon fetched him a fillip on the nose, which turned his mirth into an attack of coughing. "Oh, stop that now," said Villon, "and think of rhymes to fish." "Doubles or quits?" said Montigny doggedly. "With all my heart," quoth Thevenin. "Is there any more in that bottle?" asked the monk. "Open another," said Villon. "How do you ever hope to fill that big hogshead, your body, with little things like bottles? And how do you expect to get to heaven? How many angels do you fancy can be spared to carry up a single monk from Picardy? Or do you think yourself another Elias, and they'll send the coach for you?" "Hominibus impossibile," replied the monk as he filled his glass. Tabary was in ecstasies. Villon filliped his nose again. "Laugh at my jokes if you like," he said. "He was very good," objected Tabary. Villon made a face at him. "Think of rhymes to fish," he said. "What have you to do with Latin? You'll wish you knew none of it at the great assizes, when the devil calls for Guido Tabary, clericus. The devil with the humpback and red-hot finger-nails. Talking of the devil," he added in a whisper, "look at Montigny." All three peered covertly at the gamester. He did not seem to be enjoying his luck. His mouth was a little to a side, one nostril nearly shut, and the other much inflated. The black dog was on his back, as people say, in terrifying nursery metaphor, and he breathed hard under the gruesome burden. "He looks as if he could knife him," whispered Tabary, with round eyes. The monk shuddered, and turned his face and spread his open hands to the red embers. It was the cold that thus affected Dom Nicholas, and not any excess of moral sensibility. "Come now," said Villon, "about this ballad. How does it run so far?" And beating time with his hand, he read it aloud to Tabary. They were interrupted at the fourth rhyme by a brief and fatal movement among the gamesters. The round was completed, and Thevenin was just opening his mouth to claim another victory, when Montigny leaped up, swift as an adder, and stabbed him to the heart. The blow took effect before he had time to utter a cry, before he had time to move. A tremor or two convulsed his frame, his hands opened and shut, his heels rattled on the floor. Then his head rolled backward over one shoulder with the eyes open, and Thevenin Penset's spirit had returned to him who made it. Everyone sprang to his feet, but the business was over in 2 twos. The 4 living fellows looked at each other in rather a ghastly fashion, the dead man contemplating a corner of the roof with a singular and ugly leer. "My God!" said Tabary, and he began to pray in Latin. Villon broke out into hysterical laughter. He came a step forward and clucked a ridiculous bow at Thevenin, and laughed still louder. Then he sat down suddenly, all of a heap, upon a stool, and continued laughing bitterly, as though he would shake himself to pieces. Montigny recovered his composure first. "Let's see what he has about him," remarked, and he picked the dead man's pockets with a practised hand, and divided the money into 4 equal portions on the table. "There's for you," he said. The monk received his share with a deep sigh, and a single stealthy glance at the dead Thevenin, who was beginning to sink into himself and topple sideways off the chair. "We're all for it," cried Villon, swallowing his mirth. "It's a hanging job for every man jack of us that's here, not to speak of those who aren't." He made a shocking gesture in the air with his raised right hand, and put out his tongue and threw his head on one side, so as to counterfeit the appearance of one who has been hanged. Then he pocketed his share of the spoil, and executed a shuffle with his feet as if to restore the circulation. Tabary was the last to help himself. He made a dash at the money, and retired to the other end of the apartment. Montigny stuck Thevenin upright in the chair, and drew out the dagger, which was followed by a jet of blood. "You fellows had better be moving," he said, as he wiped the blade on his victim's doublet. "I think we had," returned Villon with a gulp. "Damn his fat head!" he broke out. "It sticks in my throat like phlegm. What right has a man to have red hair when he is dead?" And he fell all of a heap again upon the stool, and fairly covered his face with his hands. Montigny and Don Nicholas laughed aloud, even Tabary feebly chiming in. "Cry baby," said the monk. "I always said he was a woman," added Montigny with a sneer. "Sit up, can't you?" he went on, giving another shake to the murdered body. "Tread out that fire, Nick." But Nick was better employed. He was quietly taking Villon's purse as the poet sat, limp and trembling, on the stool where he had been making a ballad not 3 minutes before. Montigny and Tabary dumbly demanded a share of the booty, which the monk silently promised as he passed the little bag into the bosom of his gown. In many ways an artistic nature unfits a man for practical existence. No sooner had the theft been accomplished than Villon shook himself, jumped to his feet, and began helping to scatter and extinguish the embers. Meanwhile Montigny opened the door and cautiously peered into the street. The coast was clear. There was no meddlesome patrol in sight. Still it was judged wiser to slip out severally, and as Villon was himself in a hurry to escape from the neighbourhood of the dead Thevenin, and the rest were in a still greater hurry to get rid of him before he should discover the loss of his money, he was the first by general consent to issue forth into the street. The wind had triumphed and swept all the clouds from heaven. Only a few vapours, as thin as moonlight, fleeted rapidly across the stars. It was bitter cold, and by a common optical effect things seemed almost more definite than in the broadest daylight. The sleeping city was absolutely still. A company of white hoods, a field full of little Alps below the twinkling stars. Villon cursed his fortune. Would it were still snowing! Now, wherever he went, he left an indelible trail behind him on the glittering streets. Wherever he went, he was still tethered to the house by the cemetery of St. John. Wherever he went, he must weave, with his own plodding feet, the rope that bound him to the crime and would bind him to the gallows. The leer of the dead man came back to him with a new significance. He snapped his fingers as if to pluck up his own spirits, and choosing a street at random, stepped boldly forward in the snow. 2 things preoccupied him as he went: the aspect of the gallows at Montfaucon in this bright windy phase of the night's existence, for one, and for another the look of the dead man, with his bald head and garland of red curls. Both struck cold upon his heart, and he kept quickening his pace, as if he could escape from unpleasant thoughts by mere fleetness of foot. Sometimes he looked back over his shoulder with a sudden nervous jerk, but he was the only moving thing in the white streets, except when the wind swooped round a corner and threw up the snow, which was beginning to freeze in spouts of glittering dust. Suddenly he saw, a long way before him, a black clump and a couple of lanterns. The clump was in motion and the lanterns swung as though carried by men walking. It was a patrol. And though it was merely crossing his line of march, he judged it wiser to get out of eyeshot as speedily as he could. He was not in the humour to be challenged, and he was conscious of making a very conspicuous mark upon the snow. Just on his left hand there stood a great hotel, with some turrets and a large porch before the door. It was half ruinous, he remembered, and had long stood empty, and so he made 3 steps of it and jumped inside the shelter of the porch. It was pretty dark inside after the glimmer of the snowy streets, and he was groping forward with outspread hands, when he stumbled over some substance which offered an indescribable mixture of resistances, hard and soft, firm and loose. His heart gave a leap, and he sprang 2 steps back and stared dreadfully at the obstacle. Then he gave a little laugh of relief. It was only a woman, and she dead. He knelt beside her to make sure upon this latter point. She was freezing cold and rigid like a stick. A little ragged finery fluttered in the wind about her hair, and her cheeks had been heavily rouged that same afternoon. Her pockets were quite empty, but in her stocking, underneath the garter, Villon found 2 of the small coins that went by the names of whites. It was little enough, but it was always something, and the poet was moved with a deep sense of pathos that she should have died before she had spent her money. That seemed to him a dark and pitiable mystery, and he looked from the coins in his hand to the dead woman, and back again to the coins, shaking his head over the riddle of man's life. Henry V. of England dying at Vincennes just after he had conquered France, and this poor jade cut off by a cold draught in a great man's doorway before she had time to spend her couple of whites. It seemed a cruel way to carry on the world. 2 whites would have taken such a little while to squander, and yet it would have been one more good taste in the mouth, one more smack of the lips, before the devil got the soul, and the body was left to birds and vermin. He would like to use all his tallow before the light was blown out and the lantern broken. While these thoughts were passing through his mind, he was feeling, half mechanically, for his purse. Suddenly his heart stopped beating, a feeling of cold scales passed up the back of his legs, and a cold blow seemed to fall upon his scalp. He stood petrified for a moment, then he felt again with one feverish movement, and then his loss burst upon him, and he was covered with perspiration. To spendthrifts money is so living and actual, it is such a thin veil between them and their pleasures. There is only one limit to their fortune, that of time, and a spendthrift with only a few crowns is the Emperor of Rome until they are spent. For such a person to lose his money is to suffer the most shocking reverse, and fall from heaven to hell, from all to nothing, in a breath. And all the more he has to put his head in the halter for it, if he may be hanged to-morrow for that same purse, so dearly earned, so foolishly departed. Villon stood and cursed. He threw the 2 whites into the street, and shook his fist at heaven. He stamped, and was not horrified to find himself trampling the poor corpse. Then he began rapidly to retrace his steps toward the house beside the cemetery. He had forgotten all fear of the patrol, which was long gone by at any rate, and had no idea but that of his lost purse. It was in vain that he looked right and left upon the snow. Nothing was to be seen. He had not dropped it in the streets. Had it fallen in the house? He would have liked dearly to go in and see, but the idea of the grisly occupant unmanned him. And he saw, besides, as he drew near, that their efforts to put out the fire had been unsuccessful. On the contrary, it had broken into a blaze, and a changeful light played in the chinks of the door and window, and revived his terror for the authorities and Paris gibbet. He returned to the hotel with the porch, and groped about upon the snow for the money he had thrown away in his childish passion, but he could only find 1 white. The other had probably stuck sideways and sunk deeply in. With a single white in his pocket, all his projects for a rousing night in some wild tavern vanished utterly away, and it was not only pleasure that fled laughing from his grasp. Positive discomfort, positive pain, attacked him as he stood ruefully before the porch. His perspiration had dried upon him, and though the wind had now fallen, a binding frost was setting in stronger with every hour, and he felt benumbed and sick at heart. What was to be done? Late as was the hour, improbable as was success, he would try the house of his adopted father, the chaplain of St. Benoit. He ran there all the way and knocked timidly. There was no answer. He knocked again and again, taking heart with every stroke, and at last steps were heard approaching from within. A barred wicket fell open in the iron-studded door, and emitted a gush of yellow light. "Hold up your face to the wicket," said the chaplain from within. "It's only me," whimpered Villon. "Oh, it's only you, is it?" returned the chaplain, and he cursed him with foul unpriestly oaths for disturbing him at such an hour, and bade him to be off to hell, where he came from. "My hands are blue to the wrists," pleaded Villon. "My feet are dead and full of twinges. My nose aches with the sharp air. The cold lies in my heart. I may be dead before morning. Only this once, father, and before God I will never ask again." "You should have come earlier," said the ecclesiastic coolly. "Young men require a lesson now and then." He shut the wicket and retired deliberately into the interior of the house. Villon was beside himself. He beat upon the door with his hands and feet, and shouted hoarsely after the chaplain. "Wormy old fox," he cried, "if I had my hand under your twist, I would send you flying headlong into the bottomless pit." A door shut in the interior, faintly audible to the poet down long passages. He passed his hand over his mouth with an oath, and then the humour of the situation struck him, and he laughed and looked lightly up to heaven, where the stars seemed to be winking over his discomfiture. What was to be done? It looked very like a night in the frosty streets. The idea of the dead woman popped into his imagination and gave him a hearty fright. What had happened to her in the early night might very well happen to him before morning. And he so young, and with such immense possibilities of disorderly amusement before him. He felt quite pathetic over the notion of his own fate, as if it had been someone else's, and made a little imaginative vignette of the scene in the morning when they should find his body. He passed all his chances under review, turning the white between his thumb and forefinger. Unfortunately, he was on bad terms with some old friends who would once have taken pity on him in such a plight. He had lampooned them in verses, he had beaten and cheated them, and yet now, when he was so close to a pinch, he thought there was at least one who might perhaps relent. It was a chance, it was worth trying at least, and he would go and see. On the way 2 little accidents happened to him which coloured his musings in a very different manner. For, first he fell in with the track of a patrol, and walked in it for some yards, although it lay out of his direction. And this spirited him up, at least he had confused his trail, for he was still possessed with the idea of people tracking him all about Paris over the snow, and collaring him next morning before he was awake. The other matter affected him very differently. He passed a street corner where, not so long before, a woman and her child had been devoured by wolves. This was just the kind of weather, he reflected, when wolves might take it into their heads to enter Paris again, and a lone man in these deserted streets would run the chance of something worse than a mere scare. He stopped and looked upon the place with unpleasant interest. It was a centre where several lanes intersected each other, and he looked down them all one after another, and held his breath to listen, lest he should detect some galloping black things on the snow, or hear the sound of howling between him and the river. He remembered his mother telling him the story, and pointing out the spot, while he was yet a child. His mother! If he only knew where she lived, he might make sure at least of shelter. He determined he would inquire upon the morrow. Nay, he would go and see her, too, poor old girl. So thinking, he arrived at his destination, his last hope for the night. The house was quite dark, like its neighbours, and yet after a few taps he heard a movement overhead, a door opening, and a cautious voice asking who was there. The poet named himself in a large whisper, and waited, not without some trepidation, the result. Nor had he to wait long. A window was suddenly opened, and a pailful of slop splashed down upon the doorstep. Villon had not been unprepared for something of the sort, and had put himself as much in shelter as the nature of the porch admitted. But for all that, he was deplorably drenched below the waist. His hose began to freeze almost at once. Death from cold and exposure stared him in the face. He remembered he was of phthisical tendency, and began coughing tentatively. But the gravity of the danger steadied his nerves. He stopped a few hundred yards from the door where he had been so rudely used, and reflected with his finger to his nose. He could only see one way of getting a lodging, and that was to take it. He had noticed a house not far away, which looked as if it might be easily broken into, and thither he betook himself promptly, entertaining himself on the way with the idea of a room still hot, with a table still loaded with the remains of supper, where he might pass the rest of the black hours, and whence he should issue on the morrow with an armful of valuable plate, or even considered on what viands and what wines he should prefer. And as he was calling the roll of his favourite dainties, roast fish presented itself to his mind with an odd mixture of amusement and horror. "I shall never finish that ballad," he thought to himself, and then, with another shudder at the recollection, "Oh, damn his fat head!" he repeated fervently, and spat on the snow. The house in question looked dark at first sight, but as Villon made a preliminary inspection in search of the handiest point of attack, a little twinkle of light caught his eye from behind a curtained window. "The devil!" he thought. "People awake! Some student or some saint! Confound the crew! Can't they get drunk and lie in bed snoring like their neighbours? What's the good of curfew, and poor devils of bell ringers jumping at a rope's end in bell towers? What's the use of day if people sit up all night? The gripes to them!" He grinned as he saw where his logic was leading him. "Every man to his business, after all," added he, "and if they're awake, by the Lord, I may come by a supper honestly for this once, and cheat the devil." He went boldly to the door, and knocked with an assured hand. On both previous occasions he had knocked timidly and with some dread of attracting notice, but now, when he had just discarded the thought of a burglarious entry, knocking at a door seemed a mighty simple and innocent proceeding. The sound of his blows echoed through the house with thin phantasmal reverberations, as though it were quite empty, and these had scarcely died away before a measured tread drew nearer, a couple of bolts were withdrawn, and one wing was opened broadly, as though no guile or fear of guile were known to those within. A tall figure of a man, muscular and spare, but a little bent, confronted Villon. The head was massive in bulk, but finely sculptured, the nose blunt at the bottom, but refining upward to where it joined a pair of strong and honest eyebrows, the mouth and eyes surrounded with delicate markings, and the whole face based upon a thick white beard, boldly and squarely trimmed. Seen as it was by the light of a flickering hand lamp, it looked perhaps nobler than it had a right to do, but it was a fine face, honourable rather than intelligent, strong, simple, and righteous. "You knock late, sir," said the old man in resonant, courteous tones. Villon cringed, and brought up many servile wordings of apology. At a crisis of this sort, the beggar was uppermost in him, and the man of genius hid his head with confusion. "You are cold," repeated the old man, "and hungry? Well, step in," and he ordered him into the house with a noble enough gesture. "Some great seigneur," thought Villon, as his host, setting down the lamp on the flagged pavement of the entry, shot the bolts once more into their places. "You will pardon me if I go in front," he said, when this was done, and he preceded the poet upstairs into a large apartment, warmed with a pan of charcoal and lit by a great lamp hanging from the roof. It was very bare of furniture, only some gold plate on a sideboard, some folios, and a stand of armour between the windows. Some smart tapestry hung from the walls, representing the crucifixion of our Lord in one piece, and in another scene of shepherds and shepherdesses by a running stream. Over the chimney was a shield of arms. "Will you seat yourself?" said the old man, "and forgive me if I leave you. I am alone in my house to night, and if you are to eat, I must forage for you myself." No sooner was his host gone than Villon leaped from the chair on which he had just seated himself, and began examining the room with the stealth and passion of a cat. He weighed the gold flagons in his hand, opening all the folios, and investigated the arms upon the shield, and the stuff with which the seats were lined. He raised the window curtains, and saw that the windows were set with rich stained glass in figures, so far as he could see, of martial import. Then he stood in the middle of the room, drew a long breath, and retaining it with puffed cheeks, looked round and round him, turning on his heels, as if to impress every feature of the apartment on his memory. "7 pieces of plate," he said. "If there had been 10, I would have risked it. A fine house and a fine old master, so help me all the saints." And just then, hearing the old man's tread returning along the corridor, he stole back to his chair, and began toasting his wet legs before the charcoal pan. His entertainer had a plate of meat in one hand and a jug of wine in the other. He set down the plate upon the table, motioning Villon to draw in his chair, and going to the sideboard, brought back 2 goblets, which he filled. "I drink to your better fortune," he said, gravely touching Villon's cup with his own. "To our better acquaintance," said the poet, growing bold. A mere man of the people would have been awed by the courtesy of the old seigneur, but Villon was hardened in that matter. He had made mirth for great lords before now, and found them as black rascals as himself. And so he devoted himself to the viands with a ravenous gusto, while the old man, leaning backward, watched him with steady, curious eyes. "You have blood on your shoulder, my man," he said. Montigny must have laid his wet right hand upon him as he left the house. He cursed Montigny in his heart. "It was none of my shedding," he stammered. "I had not supposed so," returned his host quietly. "A brawl?" "Well, something of that sort," Villon admitted with a quaver. "Perhaps the fellow murdered?" "Oh no, not murdered," said the poet, more and more confused. "It was all fair play. Murdered by accident. I had no hand in it, God strike me dead," he added fervently. "One rogue the fewer, I dare say," observed the master of the house. "You may dare to say that," agreed Villon, infinitely relieved. "As big a rogue as there is between here and Jerusalem. He turned up his toes like a lamb, but it was a nasty thing to look at. I dare say you've seen dead men in your time, my lord," he added, glancing at the armor. "Many," said the old man. "I have followed the wars, as you imagine." Villon laid down his knife and fork, which he had just taken up again. "Were any of them bold?" he asked. "Oh yes, and with hair as white as mine." "I don't think I would mind the white so much," said Villon. "His was red, and he had a return of his shuddering and tendency to laughter, which he drowned with a great draught of wine. I'm a little put out when I think of it," he went on. "I knew him, damn him, and the cold gives a man fancies, or the fancies give a man cold, I don't know which." "Have you any money?" asked the old man. "I have 1 white," returned the poet, laughing. "I got it out of a dead jade's stocking in a porch. She was as dead as Caesar, poor wench, and as cold as a church, with bits of ribbon sticking in her hair. This is a hard world in winter for wolves and wenches and poor rogues like me." "I," said the old man, "Enguerrand de la Feuillée, seigneur de Brisetout, bailli du Patatrac. Who and what may you be?" Villon rose and made a suitable reverence. "I am called Francis Villon," he said, "a poor master of arts of this university. I know some Latin and a deal of vice. I can make chansons, ballades, lays, violets, and roundels, and I am very fond of wine. I was born in a garret, and I shall not improbably die upon the gallows. I may add, my lord, that from this night forward I am your lordship's very obsequious servant to command." "No servant of mine," said the knight. "My guest for this evening, and no more." "A very grateful guest," said Villon politely, and he drank in dumb show to his entertainer. "You are shrewd," began the old man, tapping his forehead, "very shrewd. You have learning, you are a clerk, and yet you take a small piece of money off a dead woman in the street. Is it not a kind of theft?" "It is a kind of theft much practised in the wars, my lord." "The wars are the field of honor," returned the old man proudly. "There a man plays his life upon the cast. He fights in the name of his lord the king, his Lord God, and all their lordships, the holy saints and angels." "Put it," said Villon, "that I were really a thief, should I not play my life also, and against heavier odds?" "For gain, and not for honor." "Gain?" repeated Villon with a shrug. "Gain! The poor fellow wants supper and takes it. So does the soldier in a campaign. Why, what are all these requisitions we hear so much about? If they are not gain to those who take them, they are loss enough to others. The men at arms drink by a good fire, while the burgher bites his nails to buy them wine and wood. I have seen a good many ploughmen swinging on trees about the country. Ay, I have seen 30 on one elm, and a very poor figure they made. And when I asked some one how all these came to be hanged, I was told it was because they could not scrape together enough crowns to satisfy the men at arms. These things are a necessity of war, which the low born must endure with constancy. It is true that some captains drive over hard. There are spirits in every rank not easily moved by pity, and indeed many follow arms who are no better than brigands." "You see," said the poet, "you cannot separate the soldier from the brigand. And what is a thief but an isolated brigand with circumspect manners? I steal a couple of mutton chops without so much as disturbing the farmer's sheep. The farmer grumbles a bit, but sups none the less wholesomely on what remains. You come up blowing gloriously on a trumpet, take away the whole sheep, and beat the farmer pitifully into the bargain. I have no trumpet. I am only Tom, Dick, or Harry. I am a rogue and a dog, and hanging's too good for me, with all my heart. But just you ask the farmer which of us he prefers. Just find out which of us he lies awake to curse on cold nights." "Look at us two," said his lordship. "I am old, strong, and honored. If I were turned from my house to morrow, hundreds would be proud to shelter me. Poor people would go out and pass the night in the streets with their children, if I merely hinted that I wished to be alone. And I find you up, wandering homeless, and picking farthings off dead women by the wayside. I fear no man has nothing. I have seen you tremble and lose countenance at a word. I wait God's summons contentedly in my own house, or, if it please the king to call me out again, upon the field of battle. You look for the gallows, a rough, swift death, without hope or honor. Is there no difference between these two?" "As far as to the moon," Villon acquiesced. "But if I had been born Lord of Brisetout, and you had been the poor scholar Francis, would the difference have been any the less? Should not I have been warming my knees at this charcoal pan, and would not you have been groping for farthings in the snow? Should not I have been the soldier, and you the thief?" "A thief!" cried the old man. "I a thief! If you understood your words, you would repent them." Villon turned out his hands with a gesture of inimitable impudence. "If your lordship had done me the honor to follow my argument," he said. "I do you too much honor in submitting to your presence," said the knight. "Learn to curb your tongue when you speak with old and honorable men, or some one hastier than I may reprove you in a sharper fashion." And he rose and paced the lower end of the apartment, struggling with anger and antipathy. Villon surreptitiously refilled his cup, and settled himself more comfortably in the chair, crossing his knees and leaning his head upon one hand and the elbow against the back of the chair. He was now replete and warm, and he was in no wise frightened of his host, having gauged him as justly as was possible between two such different characters. The night was far spent, and in a very comfortable fashion after all, and he felt morally certain of a safe departure on the morrow. "Tell me one thing," said the old man, pausing in his walk. "Are you really a thief?" "I claim the sacred rights of hospitality," returned the poet. "My lord, I am." "You are very young," the knight continued. "I should never have been so old," replied Villon, showing his fingers, "if I had not helped myself with these 10 talents. They have been my nursing mother's, and my nursing father's." "You may still repent and change." "I repent daily," said the poet. "There are few people more given to repentance than poor Francis. As for change, let somebody change my circumstances. A man must continue to eat, if it were only that he may continue to repent." "The change must begin in the heart," returned the old man, solemnly. "My dear lord," answered Villon, "do you really fancy that I steal for pleasure? I hate stealing, like any other piece of work or danger. My teeth chatter when I see a gallows. But I must eat, I must drink, I must mix in society of some sort. What the devil! Man is not a solitary animal. Cui Deus foeminam tradit. Make me the king's pantler, make me abbot of Saint Denis, make me bailli of the Patatrac, and then I shall be changed indeed. But as long as you leave me the poor scholar Francis Villon, without a farthing, why, of course, I remain the same. The grace of God is all powerful." "I should be a heretic to question it," said Francis. "It has made you Lord of Brisetout and Bailly of the Patatrac. It has given me nothing but the quick wits under my hat and these 10 toes upon my hands. May I help myself to wine? I thank you respectfully. By God's grace, you have a very superior vintage." The Lord of Brisetout walked to and fro with his hands behind his back. Perhaps he was not yet quite settled in his mind about the parallel between thieves and soldiers. Perhaps Villon had interested him by some cross thread of sympathy. Perhaps his wits were simply muddled by so much unfamiliar reasoning, but whatever the cause, he sometimes yearned to convert the young man to a better way of thinking, and could not make up his mind to drive him forth again into the street. "There is something more than I can understand in this," he said at length. "Your mouth is full of subtleties, and the devil has led you very far astray. But the devil is only a very weak spirit before God's truth, and all his subtleties vanish at a word of true honor, like darkness at morning. Listen to me once more. I learned long ago that a gentleman should live chivalrously and lovingly to God, and the king, and his lady, and though I have seen many strange things done, I have still striven to command my ways upon that rule. It is not only written in all noble histories, but in every man's heart, if he will take care to read. You speak of food and wine, and I know very well that hunger is a difficult trial to endure. But you do not speak of other wants. You say nothing of honor, of faith to God and other men, of courtesy, of love without reproach. It may be that I am not very wise, and yet I think I am. But you seem to me like one who has lost his way and made a great error in life. You are attending to the little wants, and you have totally forgotten the great and the only real ones. Like a man who should be doctoring a toothache on the judgment day. For such things as honor and love and faith are not only nobler than food and drink, but indeed I think that we desire them more, and suffer more sharply for their absence. I speak to you as I think you will most easily understand me. Are you not, while careful to fill your belly, disregarding another appetite in your heart, which spoils the pleasure of your life and keeps you continually wretched?" Villon was sensibly nettled under all this sermonizing. "You think I have no sense of honor?" cried he. "I'm poor enough, God knows. It's hard to see rich people with their gloves, and you blowing your hands. An empty belly is a bitter thing, although you speak so lightly of it. If you had had as many as I, perhaps you would change your tune. Anyway, I'm a thief, make the most of that, but I'm not a devil from hell. God strike me dead. I would have you know I've an honor of my own, as good as yours, though I don't prate about it all day long, as if it were a God's miracle to have any. It seems quite natural to me. I keep it in its box till it's wanted. Why now, look you here, how long have I been in this room with you? Did you not tell me you were alone in the house? Look at your gold plate. You're strong if you like, but you're old and unarmed, and I have my knife. What did I want but a jerk of the elbow, and here would have been you with the cold steel in your bowels, and there would have been me linking in the street with an armful of gold cups. Did you suppose I hadn't wit enough to see that? And I scorned the action. There are your damned goblets, as safe as in a church. There are you, with your heart ticking as good as new. And here am I, ready to go out again as poor as I came in, with my one white that you threw in my teeth. And you think I have no sense of honor, God strike me dead." The old man stretched out his right arm. "I will tell you what you are," he said. "You are a rogue, my man, an impudent and black-hearted rogue and vagabond. I have passed an hour with you. Oh, believe me, I feel myself disgraced. And you have eaten and drank at my table. But now I am sick at your presence, and the day has come, and the night bird should be off to his roost. Will you go before or after?" "Which you please," returned the poet, rising. "I believe you to be strictly honorable." He thoughtfully emptied his cup. "I wish I could add you were intelligent," he went on, knocking on his head with his knuckles. "Age, the brain stiff and rheumatic." The old man preceded him from a point of self-respect. Villon followed, whistling, with his thumbs in his girdle. "God pity you," said the lord of Brisetout at the door. "Good bye, papa," returned Villon with a yawn. "Many thanks for the cold mutton." The door closed behind him. The dawn was breaking over the white roofs. A chill, uncomfortable morning ushered in the day. Villon stood and heartily stretched himself in the middle of the road. "A very dull old gentleman," he thought. "I wonder what his goblets may be worth." End of A Lodging for the Night, by Robert Louis Stevenson. Recording by Lynn Thompson.
The Magic Shadow. by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Magic Shadow by Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Once upon a time there was born a man-child with a magic shadow. His case was so rare that a number of doctors have been disputing over it ever since, and picking his parents' histories and genealogies to bit to find the cause. Their inquiries do not help us much. The father drove a cab, the mother was a charwoman, and came of a consumptive family. But these facts will not quite account for a magic shadow. The birth took place on the night of a new moon, down a narrow alley into which neither moon nor sun ever penetrated beyond the third-story windows, and that is why the parents were so long in discovering their child's miraculous gift. The hospital student who attended merely remarked that the babe was small and sickly, and advised the mother to drink sound port wine while nursing him, which she could not afford. Nevertheless, the boy struggled somehow through 5 years of life, and was put into small clothes. 2 weeks after this promotion, his mother started off to scrub out a big house in the fashionable quarter, and took him with her, for the house possessed a wide garden, laid with turf and lined with espaliers, sunflowers, and hollyhocks. And as the month was August, and the family away in Scotland, there seemed no harm in letting the child run about in this paradise while she worked. A flight of steps descended from the drawing room to the garden, and as she knelt on her mat in the cool room, it was easy to keep an eye on him. Now and then she gazed out into the sunshine and called, and the boy stopped running about and nodded back, or shouted the report of some fresh discovery. By and by a sulphur butterfly excited him so that he must run up the broad stone steps with the news. The woman laughed, looking at his flushed face, then down at his shoestrings, which were untied, and then she jumped up, crying out sharply, "Stand still, child! Stand still a moment!" She might well stare. Her boy stood and smiled in the sun, and his shadow lay on the whitened steps. Only the silhouette was not that of a little breeched boy at all, but of a little girl in petticoats, and it wore long curls, whereas the charwoman's son was close cropped. The woman stepped out on the terrace to look closer. She twirled her son round and walked him down into the garden and backwards and forwards, and stood him in all manner of positions and attitudes, and rubbed her eyes. But there was no mistake. The shadow was that of a little girl. She hurried over her charing, and took the boy home for his father to see before sunset. As the matter seemed important and she did not wish people in the street to notice anything strange, they rode back in an omnibus. They might have spared their haste, however, as the cab driver did not reach home till supper time, and then it was found that in the light of a candle, even when stuck inside a carriage lamp, their son cast just an ordinary shadow. But next morning at sunrise they woke him up and carried him to the housetop, where the sunlight slanted between the chimney stacks, and the shadow was that of a little girl. The father scratched his head. "There's money in this, wife. We'll keep the thing close, and in a year or two he'll be fit to go round in a show and earn money to support our declining years." With that the poor little one's misfortunes began, for they shut him in his room, nor allowed him to play with the other children in the alley. There was no knowing what harm might come to his precious shadow. On dark nights his father walked him out along the streets, and the boy saw many curious things under the gas lamps, but never the little girl who inhabited his shadow, so that by degrees he forgot all about her, and his father kept silence. Yet all the while she grew side by side with him, keeping pace with his years. and on his 15th birthday, when his parents took him out into the country, and, in the sunshine there, revealed his secret, she was indeed a companion to be proud of. Neat of figure, trim of ankle, with masses of waving hair, but whether blonde or brunette could not be told, and alas, she had no eyes to look into. "My son," said they, "the world lies before you. Only do not forget your parents, who conferred on you this remarkable shadow." The youth promised and went off to Showman. The showman gladly hired him, for of course a magic shadow was a rarity, though not so well paying as the strong man or the fat woman, for these were worth seeing every day, whereas for weeks at a time, in dull weather or foggy, our hero had no shadow at all. But he earned enough to keep himself and help the parents at home, and was considered a success. One day, after 5 years of this, he sought the strong man and sighed, for they had become close friends. "I'm in love," he confessed. "With your shadow?" "No." "Not with the fat woman?" the strong man exclaimed with a start of jealousy. "No, I've seen her that I mean, these 3 days in the square, on her way to music lesson. She has dark brown eyes and wears yellow ribbons. I love her." "You don't say so? She's never come to her performance, I hope?" "It has been foggy ever since we came to this town." "Ah, to be sure. Then there's a chance. For you see, she would never look at you if she knew of that other. Take my advice, go into society always at night, when there is no danger. Get introduced, dance with her, sing serenades under her window, then marry her. Afterwards, well, that's your affair." So the youth went into society and met the girl he loved, and danced with her so vivaciously, and sang serenades with such feeling beneath her window, that at last she felt he was all in all to her. Then the youth asked to be allowed to see her father, who was a retired colonel, and professed himself a man of substance. He said nothing of the shadow. But it is true he had saved a certain amount. "Then, to all intents and purposes, you are a gentleman," said the retired colonel, and the wedding day was fixed. They were married in dull weather and spent a delightful honeymoon. But when spring came and brighter days, the young wife began to feel lonely, for her husband locked himself all the day long in his study, to work, as he said. He seemed to be always at work, and whenever he consented to a holiday, it was sure to fall on the bleakest and dismalest day in the week. "You are never so gay now as you were last autumn. I am jealous of that work of yours. At least," she pleaded, "let me sit with you and share your affection with it." But he laughed and denied her, and next day she peered in through the keyhole of his study. That same evening she ran away from him, having seen the shadow of another woman by his side. Then the poor man, for he had loved his wife, cursed the day of his birth and led an evil life. This lasted for 10 years, and his wife died in her father's house unforgiving. On the day of her funeral the man said to his shadow, "I see it all. We were made for each other, so let us marry. You have wrecked my life and now must save it. Only it's rather hard to marry a wife whom one can only see by sunlight and moonlight." So they were married and spent all their life in the open air, looking on the naked world and learning its secrets. And his shadow bore him children in stony ways and on the bare mountainside. And for every child that was born, the man felt the pangs of it. And at last he died and was judged, and being interrogated concerning his good deeds, began, "We too," and looked around for his shadow. A great light shone all about, but she was nowhere to be seen. In fact, she had passed before him, and his children remained on earth where men already were heaping them with flowers and calling them divine. The man folded his arms and lifted his chin. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I am simply a sinner." There are in this world certain men who create. The children of such are poems, and the half of their soul is female. For it is written that without woman no new thing shall come into the world. End of The Magic Shadow by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch. Read by Lars Rolander.
The Gentle Euphemia by Anthony Trollope. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lo, I must tell a tale of chivalry, for large white plumes are dancing in mine eyes. Keats. Chapter 1. Knowledge, so my daughter held, was all in all. Tennyson. The gentle Euphemia lived in a castle, and her father was the Count Grand Nostril. The wise Alasco, who had dwelt for 50 years in the mullioned chamber of the North Tower, was her tutor, and he taught her poetry, arithmetic, and philosophy, to love virtue and the use of the globes. And there came the Lord of Mount Fidget to her father's halls to drink the blood-red wine and make exchange of the beeves and swine of Mount Fidget against the olives and dried fruits which grow upon the slopes of Grand Nostril. For the pastures of Mount Fidget are very rich, and its beeves and swine are fat. "And peradventure I shall see the fair Euphemia," said the young lord to Lieutenant Hosbach of the Marines, who sojourned oft at the grange of Mount Fidget, and delighted more in the racquet-court, the billiard-table, and the game of cards, than in guiding the manoeuvres of his trusty men-at-arms. "Peradventure," said the young lord, "I shall see the fair Euphemia, for the poets of Grand Nostril sing of her peerless beauty, and declare her to be the pearl of pearls." "Nay, my lord," said the lieutenant, "but an you behold the girl once in that spirit, thou art but a lost man, a kestrel with a broken wing, a spavined steed, a noseless hound, a fish out of water. For credit me, the fair Euphemia wants but a husband, and therefore do the poets sing so loudly." For Lieutenant Hosbach knew that were there a lady at the Grange, the spigot would not turn so freely. "By my halidome," said the young lord, "I will know whether the poets sing sooth or not." So the Lord of Mount Fidget departed for the castle of Grand Nostril, and his beeves and his swine were driven before him. Alasco the wise sat in the mullioned chamber, with the globes before him, and Aristotle's volume under his arm, and the gentle Euphemia sat lowly on a stool at his feet, and she asked him as to the lore of the ancient schools. "Teach me," she said, "as Plato taught, and the learned Æsculapius, and Aristides the just, for I would fain walk in the paths of knowledge, and be guided by the rules of virtue." But he answered her not at all, nor did he open the books of wisdom. "Nay, my father," she said, "but the winged hours pass by, and my soul is athirst." Then he answered her and said, "My daughter, there cometh hither this day the young lord of Mount Fidget, whose beeves and swine are as the stars of heaven in number, and whose ready money in many banks brings in rich harvest of interest. He cometh hither to drink the blood-red wine with your father, and to exchange his beeves and swine for the olives and the dried fruits which grow upon the slopes of Grand Nostril, and peradventure he will ask to see thy father's daughter." Then wilt thou no longer desire to hear what Plato teaches, or how the just man did according to justice." But Euphemia replied, "Nay, my father, am I no better than other girls, that I should care for the glance of the young man's eye? Have I not sat at your feet since I was but as high as your knee? Teach me still as Plato taught." But Alasco said, "Love will still be lord of all." "He shall never be lord of me," said Euphemia. Chapter 2. And from the platform spare ye not to fire a noble salvo shot. Lord Marmion waits below. Scott. And in those days there was the rinderpest in the land among the cattle, and the swine were plagued with a sore disease. And there had gone forth an edict and a command from the Queen's counsellors, that no beeves or swine should be driven on the Queen's highways. So there came upon the Lord of Mount Fidgет men armed with authority from the Queen, and they slew his beeves and his swine, and buried their carcasses 20 fathoms deep beneath the ground. And the young lord was angered much, for he loved his beeves and his swine, and he said to himself, "What will my lord the Count Grand Nostril say unto me if I visit him with empty hands? Will the blood-red wine be poured, or shall I see the gentle Euphemia?" For the Count Grand Nostril was a hard man, and loved a bargain well. "But I have much money in many banks," said the Lord of Mount Fidget in counsel with himself, "and though my beeves and my swine are slain and buried, yet will he receive me, for the rich are ever welcome, though their hands be empty." So he went up the slopes which led to the castle of Grand Nostril. And at the portal within the safeguard of the drawbridge there were huge heaps of dried fruits and mountains of olives. And there came out to him the Count Grand Nostril, and demanded of him where were his beeves and his swine. And the Lord told the Count how men in authority from the Queen had come upon him on the road, and had slain the beasts and buried them 20 fathom beneath the earth, because of the rinderpest which raged in the land, and because of the disease among the swine. Then said the Count Grand Nostril, "And art thou come empty-handed to drink the blood-red wine, and hast thou never a horn or a tusk? If my butler draw but a sorry pint for thee, I'll butler him with a bastinado. No, not a cork. Get thee gone to thy grange." So he drew up the drawbridge, and the sweet scent of the olives and of the dried fruits were borne aloft by the zephyrs, and struck upon the envious senses of the young lord. "And shall I not see thy daughter, the gentle Euphemia?" said he. Then the Count Grand Nostril called to his archers, and bade them twang their bows. And the archers twanged their bows, and 7 arrows struck the Lord Mount Fidget full upon his breast. But their points availed naught against his steel cuirass, so he smiled and turned away. "Nay, my Lord Count Grand Nostril," said he, "thou shalt rue the day when thou treatest thus one who has ready money in many banks. I will set the lawyers at thee, and ruin thee with many costs." Then, as he walked away, the archers twanged again, and struck him on the back. The good steel turned the points, and the arrows of Grand Nostril fell blunted to the ground. But I fear there was one arrow which entered just above the joint of the knight's harness, and galled the neck of the young lord. But as he went down the slopes, there waved a kerchief from the oriel window over the eastern parapet. Chapter 3. "Oh, Coz, 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 my pretty little Coz, dost know how many fathom deep I am in love?" Shakespeare. 'Twas midnight, and there came a soft knock at the door of Alasco the Wise. But Alasco heard it not, for he was drinking in the wisdom of the ancients with all his senses, and his ears were deaf to all earthly sounds. "Sleepest thou, my father?" said the gentle Euphemia, as she opened the door, "or is thy soul buried amidst thy books?" "Daughter," said Alasco the wise, "my soul is buried among my books. The hour is short, and the night cometh, and he who maketh not his hay while the sun of life shineth shall hardly garner his crop beneath the cold, damp hand of death. But for thee, my child, and thy needs, all other things shall give way." Then he wiped his pen and put a mark in his book and closed his lexicon. "My father," said the girl, "didst thou hear my father's archers, how their bows twanged this morn?" "I heard a rattling as of dried peas against a window pane," said the sage. "It was the noise, father, of the arrows as they fell upon the breast of Lord Mount Fidget, and they fell upon his back also, and alack, one has struck him on the nape of his neck. And then he rode away. Oh, father!" "And is it thus with thee, my child?" said Alasco. "Thus, father," said Euphemia, and she hid her face upon the serge of his mantle. "Did I not say that love should still be lord of all?" said the sage. "Spare me, father," said the damsel. "Spare the child that has stood at thy footstool since she was as high as thy knee. Spare me, and aid me to save my lord." Then they sallied forth from the small wicket which opens into the forest from beneath the west barbican. Chapter 4. "Come back," he cried in grief. "My daughter, oh, my daughter!" Campbell. "When he found she'd levanted, the Count of Alsace at first turned remarkably red in the face." Barham. And in the morning the Count of Grand Nostril called for his daughter, and his eyes were red with drinking, and his breath was thick, and he sat with his head between his hands. For he had drunk the blood-red wine, sitting all alone through the night, laughing as he quaffed down goblet after goblet at the discomfiture of the Lord of Mount Fidget. "Rinderpest indeed!" he had said. "He that cometh hither empty-handed is likely to return adry. Ho, there, butler! Another stoup of Malvoisie, and let it be that with the yellow seal." But in the morning he had called for a cool tankard, and now he demanded his daughter's presence, that she might pour for him the cup which cheers but not inebriates. "Where is the Lady Euphemia? Why tarries the Lady Euphemia?" But the attendants answered him never a word. Then he called again. "Why cometh not my child to pour for her father the beverage which he loves? Now, by cock and pie, and that old greybeard detainer, he shall hence from the mullioned chamber, and that with a flea in his ear." But still they answered him not a word. Then he up with the tankard from which he had taken his morning's brewst, and flung it at the menial's head. "Thou churl, thou sot, thou knave, thou clod! Why answerest thou not thy liege and lord?" But the menial put his hands to his bruised head, and still answered he never a word. Then there entered Dame Ulrica, a poor and aged cousin of the house, who went abroad to dances and to tea parties with the gentle Euphemia. "An it please you, my Lord Count," said Dame Ulrica, "Euphemia has fled this morning by the small wicket which leads from beneath the west barbican into the forest, and Alasco the wise has gone with her." Then the Count Grand Nostril stood up in his wrath, and sat down in his wrath, and stood up in his wrath once again. "That tankard full of gold pieces," said he, "to him who shall bring me the greybeard's head." Then the archers twanged their bows, and the men-at-arms sharpened their sabres, and the volunteers looked to their rifles, and the drummers drummed, and the fifers fifed, and they let down the drawbridge, and they went forth in pursuit of the wise Alasco and the gentle Euphemia. "By cock and pie," said the Count Grand Nostril, "an it be as I expect, and that sorry knave from Mount Fidget is at the bottom of this." "In that case it will be meetest, my lord, that she should be his wife," said the Dame Ulrica, who was riding on a palfrey at his right hand. And when she spoke, the ancient virtue of the old race was to be seen in her eye, and might be heard in her voice. "Ay, thou sayest well, dame," answered the Count. "And the Lord of Mount Fidget has beeves and swine numerous as the stars, and ready money in many banks," said Dame Ulrica. For Dame Ulrica was not virtuous only, but prudent also. "By cock and pie, thou sayest sooth," said the Count Grand Nostril. And as they had now reached the Fiery Nostril, a hostel that standeth on the hill overlooking the olive gardens of the castle, the Count called loudly for the landlord's ale. "By cock and pie, this is dry work," said the Count Grand Nostril. "But we will squeeze Mount Fidget drier before we have done with him." Then the menials laughed, and the pot-bellied landlord swayed his huge paunch hither and thither as he shook his sides with merriment. "Faith, and it is my lord the Count is ever ready with his joke," said the landlord. So they paid for the beer and rode on. Chapter 5. A breathing but devoted warrior lay. 'Twas Lars bleeding fast from life away. Byron. In the upper chamber of a small cottage, covered with ivy and vines, lay the Lord of Mount Fidget, hurt unto death. For one of the arrows had touched him on the nape of the neck, and the point had been dipped in the oil of strychnine. And there leaned over his couch a widow, watching him from moment to moment, touching his lips ever and anon with orange juice mixed with brandy, and wiping the clammy dew from his cold brow. "Lord of Mount Fidget," she said, "when my dear husband was torn from my widowed arms, thy father gave unto the poor widow this cottage. Would I could repay the debt with my heart's blood." "Aha! Alas! Alack! And well a day!" said the young lord. "Naught can repay me now, either interest or principal. All my money at all the banks cannot prolong my life 1 hour. No, nor my beeves and swine, though they outnumber the stars of heaven, and are fatter than a butter tub. It is all up with poor Mount Fidget." "Nay, say not so, my lord. If only I could reach the wise man that liveth in the mullioned chamber of the North Tower, he hath a medicine that might yet be of avail." Then Mount Fidget demanded who was the wise man, and where was the mullioned chamber of the North Tower, and when he learned that aid could be had only from the castle of Grand Nostril, he sighed amain, and sighed again, and then thus he addressed the widow: "Ay, help from Grand Nostril, yes, but not such aid as that. I want no gray-bearded senior to rack my dying brains with wise saws. But if it might be given me to let my eyes rest but once on the form of the gentle Euphemia, methinks I could die contented." Then the door of the chamber was opened, and there entered a young page, whose slashed doublet and silken hose were foul with the mud of many lanes, and the dirt of the forest clung to his short cloak, and his hair was wet with the dropping of the leaves, and his cap was crushed, and his jacket was torn. "He is here! He is here!" said the page. "I have followed him by his blood through the forest." Then the page fell at the bed foot, and there he fainted. Chapter 6. Meanwhile war arose. Milton. But as the page sank upon the floor, a small bottle fell from his breastcoat pocket, and the widow saw that it was labeled "Antidote for the oil of strychnine." Then the widow's heart leaped for joy, and as she poured the precious drops into the gaping wound, she said a prayer that the page might recover also. But what noise is this of horses and of men around this humble vineyard of the poor widow? "Tiraloo, tiraloo, tiraloo, oo!" "Ha!" said the Mount Fidget, raising himself on his elbow. "'Tis the war cry of the Grand Nostril. "Rout-a-dow, rout-a-dow, rout-a-dow, dow!" then greeted his ears. "Ha! ha!" he cried. Rout-a-dow, ah, rout-a-dow, rout-a-dow-dow, 'tis the war cry of the Mount Fidget. And he grasped the sword which lay beneath his pillow. Mount Fidget to the rescue! Shall a man lie still and perish beneath the bedclothes? Ha! A hossback! Ho! A Walker! For Walker was the captain of the men-at-arms at Mount Fidget, and the lord knew the voice of his trusty clansman. Then the widow looked through the lattice window, and told him how the fight went. But no one thought of the page upon whose brow the clammy hand of death was falling as he lay at the bed-foot. Chapter 7. Close against her heaving breast something in her hand is pressed. Longfellow. Alas, go the wise had been left in the forest, and was unable to stir another step. "'Tis the blood of the Mount Fidget," he had said when he saw the gouts upon the path. "I know it by its purple hue, and by its violet-scented perfume. Follow it on, but take that bottle with thee. And stay, lest thy sex betray thee to ill usage from the boors, take this page's raiment, which I carry in my wallet, and put the bottle in thy breast-coat pocket. If thou find, as is too likely, a gaping wound in the nape of the neck, naught can restore him but this. Pour it in freely, and he shall live. But if he shall first have heard the war cry of thy father to disturb him, then he shall surely die." So the gentle Euphemia had gone through the forest, and had reached the chamber of the widow, in which lay the lord of Mount Fidget. And as she lay at the foot of the bed, slowly there came back upon her mind a knowledge that she was there. She put her hand to her bosom in haste, and found that the bottle was gone. Then a terrible sound greeted her ears, and she heard the war cry of her father. "Terraloo! Terraloo! Terraloo! He is dead!" she cried, springing to her feet. "He is dead, and I will die also." Then the widow knew that it was the gentle Euphemia. "No, thou gentlest one," she said, "he shall not die. He shall live to count the fat beeves and the many swine of Mount Fidget, and shall be the possessor of much money in many banks, and thou gentlest one, shalt share his blessings. For love shall still be lord of all." "I do confess," said the gentle Euphemia, in a silvern whisper that was heard by him beneath the bedclothes, "I do confess that love is lord of me." Then she sank upon the floor. Chapter 8. I charge you be his faithful and true wife. Keep warm his hearth and clean his board, and when he speaks, be quick in your obedience. Elizabeth B. Browning. And then they all returned to the castle of Grand Nostril, and on their way they took up the wise Alasco, who had remained in the forest. "Nay, father," said the damsel, smiling, "but thou hast been right in all things, and hast taught me better than Plato ever taught." "And was not I young once myself?" said the sage. So when the blood-red wine had warmed his old veins, and made supple the joints of his aged legs, he tripped a measure in the castle hall, and was very jocund. So the lord of Mount Fidget was married to the gentle Euphemia, but when 3 months were past and gone, Lieutenant Hossback had returned to his regimental duties, and love shall still be lord of all. Anthony Trollope. End of The Gentle Euphemia. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina.
Love in a Cottage by Francis A. Durward. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Love in a Cottage by Francis A. Durward. "Tell me, Charlie, who is that fascinating creature in blue that waltzes so divinely?" asked young Frank Belmont of his friend Charles Hastings, as they stood playing wallflower for the moment at a military ball.
Julia Heathcote, answered Charles, with half a sigh. An old flame of mine. I proposed, but she refused me. On what ground? Simply because I had a comfortable income. Her head is full of romantic notions, and she dreams of nothing but love in a cottage. She contends that poverty is essential to happiness, and money its bane. Have you given up all hopes of her? Entirely. In fact, I am engaged. Then you have no objection to my addressing this dear romantic angel? None whatever. But I see my fiancée. Excuse me, I must walk through the next quadrille with her. Frank Belmont was a stranger in Boston, a New Yorker, immensely rich and fashionable, but his reputation had not preceded him, and Charley Hastings was the only man who knew him in New England. He procured an introduction to the beauty from one of the managers, and soon danced and talked himself into her good graces. In fact, it was a clear case of love at first sight on both sides. The enamoured pair were sitting apart enjoying a most delightful tête-à-tête. Suddenly Belmont heaved a deep sigh. "Why do you sigh, Mr. Belmont?" asked the fair Julia, somewhat pleased with this proof of sensibility. "Is not this a gay scene?" "Alas, yes," replied Belmont gloomily. "But fate does not permit me to mingle habitually in scenes like this. They only make my ordinary life doubly gloomy. And even here I deem to see the shadow of a fiend waving me away. What right have I to be here?" "What fiend do you allude to?" asked Miss Heathcote with increasing interest. "A fiend hardly presentable in good society," replied Belmont bitterly. "One could tolerate a Mephistopheles, a dignified fiend, with his pockets full of money, but my tormentor, if personified, would appear with seedy boots and a shocking bad hat. How absurd!" "It is too true," sighed Belmont. "And the name of this fiend is Poverty." "Are you poor?" "Yes, madam, I am poor, and when I would fain render myself agreeable in the eyes of beauty, in the eyes of one I could love, this fiend whispers me, 'Beware, you have nothing to offer her but love in a cottage.'" "Mr. Belmont," said Julia, with sparkling eyes and a voice of unusual animation, "although there are sordid souls in this world who only judge of the merits of an individual by his pecuniary possessions, I am not one of that number. I respect poverty. There is something highly poetical about it, and I imagine that happiness is oftener found in the humble cottage than beneath the palace roof." Belmont appeared enchanted with this encouraging avowal. The next day, after cautioning his friend Charley to say nothing of his actual circumstances, he called on the widow Heathcote and her fair daughter in the character of the poor gentleman. The widow had very different notions from her romantic offspring, and when Belmont candidly confessed his poverty on soliciting permission to address Julia, he was very politely requested to change the subject and never mention it again. The result of all this manoeuvring was an elopement, the belle of the ball jumping out of a chamber window on a shed and coming down a flight of steps to reach her lover, for the sake of being romantic, when she might just as well have walked out of the front door. The happy couple passed a day in New York City, and then Frank took his beloved to his cottage. An Irish hack conveyed them to a miserable shanty in the environs of New York, where they alighted, and Frank, escorting the bride into the apartment which served for parlor, kitchen, and drawing room, and was neither papered nor carpeted, introduced her to his mother, much in the way Claude Melnotte presents Pauline. The old woman, who was peeling potatoes, hastily wiped her hands and face with a greasy apron, and saluted her "darter," as she called her, on both cheeks. "Can it be possible," thought Julia, "that this vulgar creature is my Belmont's mother?" "Frank," screamed the old woman, "you'd better go right up stairs and take off them clothes, for the boy's been sent arter 'em more than 50 times. Frank, borry them clothes, ma'am." she added to Julia by way of explanation, "to look smart when he went down East." The bridegroom retired of this hint, and soon reappeared in a pair of faded nankeen pantaloons reaching to about the calf of the leg, a very shabby black coat out at the elbows, a ragged black vest, and instead of his varnished leather boots, a pair of immense cowhide brogans. "Now," said he, sitting quietly down by the cooking stove, "I begin to feel at home. Ah, this is delightful, isn't it, dearest?" And he warbled, "Though never so humble, there's no place like home." Julia's heart swelled so that she could not utter a word. "Dearest," said Frank, "I think you told me you had no objection to smoking." "None in the least," said the bride. "I rather like the flavor of a cigar." "Oh, a cigar," replied Belmont. "That would never do for a poor man." And, oh horror, he produced an old clay pipe, and filling it from a little newspaper parcel of tobacco, began to smoke with a keen relish. "Dinner, dinner!" he exclaimed at length. "Ah, thank you, mother. I'm as hungry as a bear. Codfish and potatoes, Julia, not very tempting fare, but what of that? Our ailment is love." "Yes, and by way of treat," added the old woman, "I been and gone and bought a whole pint of Albany ale and 3 cream cakes from the candy shop next block." Poor Julia pleaded indisposition, and could not eat a mouthful. Before Belmont, however, the codfish and potatoes and the ale and cream cakes disappeared with a very unromantic and unlover-like velocity. At the close of the meal a thundering double knock was heard at the door. "Come in!" cried Belmont. A low-browed man in a green waistcoat entered. "Now, Mr. Belmont," he exclaimed in a strong Hibernian accent, "are ye ready to go to work? By the powers, if I don't see ye sail to morrow on the shopboard, I'll discharge ye without a character, and ye shall starve on the top of that." "To morrow morning, Mr. Maloney," replied Belmont meekly. "I'll be at my post." "And it'll be mighty healthy for you to do that same," replied the man as he retired. "Belmont, speak! Tell me!" gasped Julia. "Who is that man, that loafer?" "He's my employer," answered Belmont, smiling. "And his profession?" "He's a tailor." "And you?" "I'm a journeyman tailor at your service. A laborious and thankless calling it ever was to me. But now, dearest, as I drive the hissing goose across the smoking seam, I shall think of my own angel and my dear cottage and be happy." That night Julia retired weeping to her room in the attic. "That 'ere counterpane darter," said the old woman. "I worked with these here old hands. Ain't it putty? I hope you'll sleep well here. There's a broken pane of glass, but I put one of Frank's old hats in it, and I don't think you'll feel the draught. There used to be a good many rats here, but I don't think they'll trouble you now, for Frank's been a piecin' in of 'em." Left alone, Julia threw herself into a chair and burst into a flood of tears. Even Belmont had ceased to be attractive in her eyes. The stern privations that surrounded her banished all thoughts of love. The realities of life had cured her in one day of all her quixotic notions. "Well, Julia, how do you like poverty and love in a cottage?" asked Belmont, entering in his bridal dress. "Not so well, sir, as you seem to like that borrowed suit," answered the bride, reddening with vexation. "Very well, you shall suffer it no longer. My carriage awaits your orders at the door." "Your carriage, indeed!" "Yes, dearest. It waits but for you to bear us to Belmont Hall, my lovely villa on the Hudson." "And your mother?" "I have no mother, alas! The old woman down stairs is an old servant of the family." "Then you've been deceiving me, Frank. How wicked!" "It was all done with good motive. You were not born to endure a life of privation, but to shine the ornament of an elegant and refined circle. I hope you will not love me the less when you learn that I am worth nearly 500,000. That's the melancholy fact, and I can't help it." "Oh, Frank!" cried the beautiful girl, and hid her face in his bosom. She presided with grace at the elegant festivities of Belmont Hall, and seemed to support her husband's wealth and luxurious style of living with the greatest fortitude and resignation, never complaining of her comforts, nor murmuring a wish for living in a cottage. End of Love in a Cottage by Frances A. Durivage, read by Lars Rolander.
The Clicking of Cuthbert by P.G. Wodehouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The young man came into the smoking room of the clubhouse and flung his bag with a clatter on the floor. He sank moodily into an armchair and pressed the bell. "Waiter!" "Sir?" The young man pointed at the bag with every evidence of distaste. "You may have these clubs," he said. "Take them away. If you don't want them yourself, give them to one of the caddies." Across the room the oldest member gazed at him with a grave sadness through the smoke of his pipe. His eye was deep and dreamy, the eye of a man who, as the poet says, has seen golf steadily and seen it whole. "You're giving up golf?" he said. He was not altogether unprepared for such an attitude on the young man's part, for from his eyrie on the terrace above the ninth green he had observed him start out on the afternoon's round, and had seen him lose a couple of balls in the lake at the second hole after taking 7 strokes at the first. "Yes," cried the young man fiercely. "Forever, damn it! Footling game! Blanked infernal fat-headed silly ass of a game! Nothing but a waste of time!" The sage winced. "Don't say that, my boy." "But I do say it. What earthly good is golf? Life is stern and life is earnest. We live in a practical age. All round us we have foreign competition making itself unpleasant, and we spend our time playing golf. What do we get out of it? Is golf any use? That's what I'm asking you. Can you name me a single case where devotion to this pestilential pastime has done a man any practical good?" The sage smiled gently. "I could name 1,000. One will do." "I will select," said the sage, "from the innumerable memories that rush on my mind, the story of Cuthbert Banks." "Never heard of him." "Be of good cheer," said the oldest member. "You are going to hear of him now." "It was in the picturesque little settlement of Wood Hills," said the oldest member, "that the incidents occurred which I am about to relate. Even if you have never been in Wood Hills, that suburban paradise is probably familiar to you by name. Situated at a convenient distance from the city, it combines in a notable manner the advantages of town life with the pleasant surroundings and healthful air of the country. Its inhabitants live in commodious houses standing in their own grounds, and enjoy so many luxuries, such as gravel soil, main drainage, electric light, telephone baths, and company's own water, that you might be pardoned for imagining life to be so ideal for them that no possible improvement could be added to their lot. Mrs. Willoughby Smethurst was under no such delusion. What Wood Hills needed to make it perfect, she realized, was culture. Material comforts are all very well, but if the summum bonum is to be achieved, the soul who demands a look in, and it was Mrs. Smethurst's unfaltering resolve that never while she had her strength should the soul be handed the loser's end. It was her intention to make Wood Hills a centre of all that was most cultivated and refined, and golly, how she had succeeded! Under her presidency the Wood Hills Literary and Debating Society had tripled its membership. But there is always a fly in the ointment, a caterpillar in the salad. The local golf club, an institution to which Mrs. Smethurst strongly objected, had also tripled its membership, and the division of the community into two rival camps, the golfers and the cultured, had become more marked than ever. This division, always acute, had attained now to the dimensions of schism. The rival sects treated one another with a cold hostility. Unfortunate episodes came to widen the breach. Mrs. Smethurst's house adjoined the links, standing to the right of the fourth tee, and as the literary society was in the habit of entertaining visiting lecturers, many a golfer had foozled his drive owing to sudden loud outbursts of applause coinciding with the downswing. And not long before the story opens, a sliced ball, whizzing in at the open window, had come within an ace of incapacitating Raymond Parsloe Devine, the rising young novelist, who rose at the moment a clear foot and a half from any further exercise of his art. 2 inches indeed to the right, and Raymond must inevitably have handed in his dinner pail. To make matters worse, a ring at the front door bell followed almost immediately, and the maid ushered in a young man of pleasing appearance in a sweater and baggy knickerbockers, who apologetically but firmly insisted on playing his ball where it lay, and what with the shock of the lecturer's narrow escape, and the spectacle of the intruder standing on the table and working away with a niblick, the afternoon's session had to be classed as a complete frost. Mr. Devine's determination, from which no argument could swerve him, to deliver the rest of his lecture in the coal cellar, gave the meeting a jolt from which it never recovered. I have dwelt upon this incident because it was the means of introducing Cuthbert Banks to Mrs. Smethurst's niece Adeline. As Cuthbert, for it was he who had so nearly reduced the muster roll of rising novelist by one, hopped down from the table after his talk, he was suddenly aware that a beautiful girl was looking at him intently. As a matter of fact, everyone in the room was looking at him intently, none more so than Raymond Parsloe Devine, but none of the others were beautiful girls. Long as the members of Wood Hills Literary Society were no brain, they were short on looks, and to Cuthbert's excited eye, Adeline Smethurst stood out like a jewel in a pile of coke. He had never seen her before, for she had only arrived at her aunt's house on the previous day. But he was perfectly certain that life, even when lived in the midst of gravel soil, main drainage, and company's own water, was going to be a pretty poor affair if he did not see her again. Yes, Cuthbert was in love. And it is interesting to record, as showing the effect of the tender emotion on a man's game, that 20 minutes after he had met Adeline, he did the short 11th in one, and as near as a toucher got a 3 on the 400-yard 12th. I will skip lightly over the intermediate stages of Cuthbert's courtship and come to the moment when, at the annual ball in aid of the local cottage hospital, the only occasion during the year on which the lion, so to speak, lay down with the lamb, and the golfers and the cultured met on terms of easy comradeship, their differences temporarily laid aside, he proposed to Adeline and was badly stymied. That fair, soulful girl could not see him with a spyglass. "Mr. Banks," she said, "I will speak frankly." "Charge ahead," assented Cuthbert. "Deeply sensible as I am I know, of the honor and the compliment and all that. But passing lightly over all that guff, what seems to be the trouble? I love you to distraction." "Love is not everything." "You are wrong," said Cuthbert earnestly. "You are right of it. Love—" and he was about to dilate on the theme when she interrupted him. "I am a girl of ambition." "And very nice too," said Cuthbert. "I am a girl of ambition," repeated Adeline, "and I realize the fulfillment of my ambitions must come through my husband. I am very ordinary myself." "What?" cried Cuthbert. "You ordinary? Why, you are a pearl among women, the queen of your sex. You can't have been looking in a glass lately. You stand alone. Simply alone. You make the rest look like battered repaints. Well, said Adeline, softening a trifle, I believe I am fairly good looking. Anybody who was content to call you fairly good looking would describe the Taj Mahal as a pretty nifty tomb. But that is not the point. What I mean is, if I marry a non-entity, I shall be a non-entity myself forever, and I would sooner die than be a non-entity. And if I follow your reasoning, you think that lets me out. Well, really, Mr. Banks, have you done anything, or are you likely ever to do anything worthwhile? Cuthbert hesitated. It's true, he said. I didn't finish in the first 10 in the Open, and was knocked out in the semi-final of the Amateur, but I won the French Open last year. The what? The French Open Championship. Golf, you know. Golf? You waste all your time playing golf? I admire a man who is more spiritual, more intellectual. A pang of jealousy rent Cuthbert's bosom. Like what's his name, Devine? He said sullenly. Mr. Devine, replied Adeline, blushing faintly, is going to be a great man. Already he has achieved much. The critics say that he is more Russian than any other young English writer. And is that good? Of course, it's good. I should have thought the wheeze would be to be more English than any other young English writer. Nonsense. Who wants an English writer to be English? You have got to be Russian or Spanish or something to be a real success. The mantle of the great Russians has descended on Mr. Devine. From what I have heard of Russians, I should hate to have that happen to me. There is no danger of that, said Adeline scornfully. Oh, well, let me tell you that there is a lot more in me than you think. That might easily be so. You think I am not spiritual and intellectual, said Cuthbert, deeply moved. Very well. Tomorrow I join the Literary Society. Even as he spoke the words, his leg was itching to kick himself for being such a chump. But the sudden expression of pleasure on Adeline's face soothed him, and he went home that night with the feeling that he had taken on something rather attractive. It was only in the cold, grey light of the morning that he realized what he had let himself in for. I do not know if you have had any experience of suburban literary societies, but the one that flourished under the eye of Mrs. Willoughby Smethurst at Woodhills was rather more so than the average. With my feeble powers of narrative, I cannot hope to make clear to you all the Cuthbert Banks endured in the next few weeks. And even if I could, I doubt if I should do so. It is all very well to excite pity and terror, as Aristotle recommends, but there are limits. In the ancient Greek tragedies, it was an ironclad rule that all the real rough stuff should take place offstage, and I shall follow this admirable principle. It will suffice if I say merrily that J. Cuthbert Banks had a thin time. After attending 11 debates and 14 lectures on vers libre poetry, the 17th century essays, the new Scandinavian movement in Portuguese literature, and other subjects of a similar nature, he grew so enfeebled that, on the rare occasions when he had time for a visit to the links, he had to take a full iron for his mashy shots. It was not simply the oppressive nature of the debates and lectures that sapped his vitality. What really got him right in amongst him was the torture of seeing Adeline's adoration of Raymond Parsloe Devine. The man seemed to have made the deepest possible impression upon her plastic emotions. When he spoke, she leaned forward with parted lips and looked at him. When he was not speaking, which was seldom, she leaned back and looked at him. And when he happened to take the next seat to her, she leaned sideways and looked at him. One glance at Mr. Devine would have been more than enough for Cuthbert, but Adeline found him a spectacle that never palled. She could not have gazed at him with a more rapturous intensity if she had been a small child and he a saucer of ice cream. All this Cuthbert had to witness while still endeavouring to retain the possession of his faculties sufficiently to enable him to duck and back away if somebody suddenly asked him what he thought of the sombre realism of Vladimir Brusiloff. It is little wonder that he tossed in bed, picking at the coverlet, through sleepless nights, and had to have all his waistcoat taken in 3 inches to keep them from sagging. The Vladimir Brusilov to whom I have referred was the famous Russian novelist, and owing to the fact of his being in the country on a lecturing tour at the moment, there had been something of a boom in his works. The Wood Hills Literary Society had been studying them for weeks, and never since his first entrance into intellectual circles had Cuthbert Banks come nearer to throwing in the towel. Vladimir specialized in grey studies of hopeless misery, where nothing happened till page 380, when the moujik decided to commit suicide. It was tough going for a man whose deepest reading hitherto had been Warden on the Push Shot. And there can be no greater proof of the magic of love than the fact that Cuthbert struck it without a cry. But the strain was terrible, and I am inclined to think that he must have cracked. Had it not been for the daily reports in the papers of the internecine strife which was proceeding so briskly in Russia, Cuthbert was an optimist at heart, and it seemed to him that at the rate at which the inhabitants of that interesting country were murdering one another, the supply of Russian novelists must eventually give out. One morning, as he tottered down the road for the short walk, which was now almost the only exercise to which he was equal, Cuthbert met Adeline. A spasm of anguish flitted through all his nerve centers as he saw that she was accompanied by Raymond Parsloe Devine. "Good morning, Mr. Banks," said Adeline. "Good morning," said Cuthbert hollowly. "Such good news about Vladimir Brusilov." "Dead?" said Cuthbert with a touch of hope. "Dead? Of course not. Why should he be? No. Aunt Emily met his manager after his lecture at Queen's Hall yesterday, and he has promised that Mr. Brusilov shall come to her next Wednesday reception." "Oh, ah!" said Cuthbert dully. "I don't know how she managed it. I think she must have told him that Mr. Devine would be there to meet him." "But you said he was coming," argued Cuthbert.
I shall be very glad," said Raymond Devine, "of the opportunity of meeting Brusilov."
"I am sure," said Adeline, "he will be very glad of the opportunity of meeting you."
"Possibly," said Mr. Devine, "possibly. Competent critics have said that my work closely resembles that of the great Russian masters."
"Your psychology is so deep."
"Yes, yes."
"And your atmosphere."
"Quite."
Cuthbert, in a perfect agony of spirit, prepared to withdraw from his love feast. The sun was shining brightly, but the world was black to him. Birds sang in the tree tops, but he did not hear them. He might have been a moujik for all the pleasures he found in life. "You will be there, Mr. Banks," said Adeline, as she turned away. "Oh, all right," said Cuthbert. When Cuthbert had entered the drawing room on the following Wednesday, and had taken his usual place in a distant corner where, while able to feast his gaze on Adeline, he had a sporting chance of being overlooked or mistaken for a piece of furniture, he perceived the great Russian thinker seated in the midst of a circle of admiring females. Raymond Parsloe Devine had not yet arrived. His first glance at the novelist surprised Cuthbert. Doubtless with the best motives, Vladimir Brusilov had permitted his face to become almost entirely concealed behind a dense zareba of hair, but his eyes were visible through the undergrowth, and it seemed to Cuthbert that there was an expression in them not unlike that of a cat in a strange backyard surrounded by small boys. The man looked forlorn and hopeless, and Cuthbert wondered whether he had had bad news from home. This was not the case. The latest news which Vladimir Brusilov had had from Russia had been particularly cheering. 3 of his principal creditors had perished in the last massacre of the bourgeoisie, and a man whom he owed for 5 years for a samovar and a pair of overshoes had fled the country, and had not been heard of since. It was not bad news from home that was depressing Vladimir. What was wrong with him was the fact that this was the 82nd suburban literary reception he had been compelled to attend since he had landed in the country on his lecturing tour, and he was sick to death of it. When his agent had first suggested the trip, he had signed on the dotted line without an instant's hesitation. Worked out in rubles, the fees offered had seemed just about right. But now, as he peered through the brushwood at the faces round him, and realized that 8 out of 10 of those present had manuscripts of some sort concealed on their persons, and were only waiting for an opportunity to whip them out and start reading, he wished that he had stayed at his quiet home in Nijni Novgorod, where the worst thing that could happen to a fellow was a brace of bombs coming in through the window and mixing themselves up with his breakfast egg. At this point in his meditations he was aware that his hostess was looming up before him, with a pale young man in horn-rimmed spectacles at her side. There was in Mrs. Smethurst's demeanour something of the unction of the master of ceremonies at the big fight who introduces the earnest gentleman who wishes to challenge the winner. "Oh, Mr. Brusiloff," said Mrs. Smethurst, "I do want you to meet Mr. Raymond Parslow Devine, whose work I expect you know. He is one of our younger novelists." The distinguished visitor peered in a wary and defensive manner through the shrubbery, but did not speak. Inwardly he was thinking how exactly like Mr. Devine was to the 81 other younger novelists to whom he had been introduced at various hamlets throughout the country. Raymond Parslow Devine bowed courteously, while Cuthbert, wedged into his corner, glowered at him. "The critics," said Mr. Devine, "have been kind enough to say that my poor efforts contain a good deal of the Russian spirit. I owe much to the great Russians. I have been greatly influenced by Sovietsky." Down in the forest something stirred. It was Vladimir Brusiloff's mouth opening, as he prepared to speak. He was not a man who prattled readily, especially in a foreign tongue. He gave the impression that each word was excavated from his interior by some up-to-date process of mining. He glared bleakly at Mr. Devine, and allowed 3 words to drop out of him. "Sovietsky no good." He paused for a moment, set the machinery working again, and delivered 5 more at the pithead. "I speak me of Sovietsky." There was a painful sensation. The lot of a popular idol is in many ways an enviable one, but it has the drawback of uncertainty. Here today and gone tomorrow. Until this moment Raymond Parslow Devine's stock had stood at something considerably over par in Woodhill's intellectual circles, but now there was a rapid slump. Hitherto he had been greatly admired for being influenced by Sovietsky, but it appeared now that this was not a good thing to be. It was evidently a rotten thing to be. The law could not touch you for being influenced by Sovietsky, but there is an ethical as well as a legal code, and this it was obvious that Raymond Parslow Devine has transgressed. Women drew away from him slightly, holding their skirts. Men looked at him censoriously. Adeline Smethurst started violently and dropped a teacup, and Cuthbert Banks, doing his popular imitation of a sardine in his corner, felt for the first time that life held something of sunshine. Raymond Parslow Devine was plainly shaken, but he made an adroit attempt to recover his lost prestige. "When I say I have been influenced by Sovietsky, I mean of course that I was once under his spell. A young writer commits many follies. I have long since passed through that phase. The false glamour of Sovietsky has ceased to dazzle me. I now belong wholeheartedly to the school of Nastikoff." There was a reaction. People nodded at one another sympathetically. After all, we cannot expect old heads on young shoulders, and a lapse at the outset of one's career should not be held against one who has eventually seen the light. "Nastikoff no good," said Vladimir Brusiloff coldly. He paused, listening to the machinery. "Nastikoff worse than Sovietsky." He paused again. "I spit me on Nastikoff," he said. This time there was no doubt about it. The bottom had dropped out of the market, and Raymond Parslow Devine preferred were down in the cellar with no takers. It was clear to the entire assembled company that they had been all wrong about Raymond Parslow Devine. They had allowed him to play on their innocence and sell them a pup. They had taken him at his own valuation, and had been cheated into admiring him as a man who amounted to something, and all the while he had belonged to the school of Nastikoff. You never can tell. Mrs. Smethurst's guests were well bred, and there was consequently no violent demonstration, but you could see by their faces what they felt. Those nearest Raymond Parslow jostled to get further away. Mrs. Smethurst eyed him stonily through a raised lorgnette. One or two low hisses were heard, and over at the other end of the room somebody opened the window in a marked manner. Raymond Parslow Devine hesitated for a moment, then, realizing his situation, turned and slunk to the door. There was an audible sigh of relief as it closed behind him. Vladimir Brusilov proceeded to sum up. No novelist any good except me. Sovietsky, yeah. Nastikov, bah! I spit me on them all. No novelist anywhere any good except me. P.G. Wodehouse and Tolstoy, not bad. Not good, but not bad. No novelist any good except me. And having uttered this dictum, he removed a slab of cake from a nearby plate, stirred it through the jungle, and began to champ. It is too much to say that there was a dead silence. There could never be that in any room in which Vladimir Brusilov was eating cake. But certainly what you might call the journal chit-chat was pretty well down and out. Nobody liked to be the first to speak. The members of the Woodhill Literary Society looked at one another timidly. Cuthbert, for his part, gazed at Adeline, and Adeline gazed into space. It was plain that the girl was deeply stirred. Her eyes were opened wide, a faint flush crimsoned her cheeks, and her breath was coming quickly. Adeline's mind was in a whirl. She felt as if she had been walking gaily along a pleasant path and had stopped suddenly on the very brink of a precipice. It would be idle to deny that Raymond Parslow Devine had attracted her extraordinarily. She had taken him at his own valuation as an extremely hot potato, and her hero worship had gradually been turning into love. And now her hero had been shown to have feet of clay. It was hard, I consider, on Raymond Parslow Devine, but that is how it goes in this world. You get a following as a celebrity, and then you run up against another bigger celebrity, and your admirers desert you. One could moralize on this at considerable length, but better not, perhaps. Enough to say that the glamour of Raymond Parslow Devine ceased abruptly in that moment for Adeline, and her most coherent thought at this juncture was the resolve, as soon as she got up to her room, to burn the 3 signed photographs he had sent her and to give the autographed presentation set of his books to the grocer's boy. Mrs. Smethurst, meanwhile, having rallied somewhat, was endeavouring to set the feast of reason and flow of soul going again. "And how do you like England, Mr. Brusiloff?" she asked. The celebrity paused in the act of lowering another segment of cake. "Damn good," he replied cordially. "I suppose you have travelled all over the country by this time?" "You said it," agreed the thinker. "Have you met many of our great public men?" Yeah, quite a few of Nibs. Lloyd George, I met him. But beneath the matting a discontented expression came into his face, and his voice took on a peevish note. But I not meet your real great men. Your Arbmishel, your Arrevedon. I not meet them. That's what gives me the pipovit. Have you ever met Arbismel and Arrivedon? A strained, anguished look came into Mrs. Smethurst's face and was reflected in the faces of the other members of the circle. The eminent Russian had sprung 2 entirely new ones on them, and they felt that their ignorance was about to be exposed. What would Vladimir Brusilov think of the Woodhills Literary Society? The reputation of the Woodhills Literary Society was at stake, trembling in the balance and coming up for the 3rd time. In dumb agony, Mrs. Smethurst rolled her eyes about the room, searching for someone capable of coming to the rescue. She drew blank. And then, from a distant corner, there sounded a deprecating cough, and those nearest Cuthbert Banks saw that he had stopped twisting his right foot round his left ankle, and his left foot round his right ankle, and was sitting up with a light of almost human intelligence in his eyes. "Er," said Cuthbert, blushing as every eye in the room seemed to fix itself on him. "I think he means Abbe Michel and Harry Verdon." Abe Mitchell and Harry Verdon? Repeated Mrs. Smethurst blankly. I never heard of. Yeah, most, very, said Vladimir Brusilov enthusiastically. Arbe Mitchell and Harry Verdon. You knew them? Yes. What? No? Perhaps? I have played with Abe Mitchell often, and I was partnered with Harry Verdon in last year's Open. The great Russian uttered a cry that shook the chandelier. You play in the Open? Why? He demanded reproachfully of Mrs. Smethurst. Was I not been introduced to this young man who play in Opens? Well, really, faltered Mrs. Smethurst. Well, the fact is, Mr. Brusiloff, she broke off. She was unequal to the task of explaining, without hurting anyone's feeling, that she had always regarded Cuthbert as a piece of cheese and a blot on the landscape. Introduct me, thundered the celebrity. Why, certainly, of course. This is Mr. She looked appealingly at Cuthbert. Banks, prompted Cuthbert. Banks? Cried Vladimir Brusilov. Not Cootaboot Banks? Is your name Cootaboot? Asked Mrs. Smethurst faintly. Well, it's Cuthbert. Yeah, Cootaboot. There was a rush and swirl as the effervescent Muscovite burst his way through the throng and rushed to where Cuthbert sat. He stood for a moment, eyeing him excitedly, then, stooping swiftly, kissed him on both cheeks before Cuthbert could get his guard up. My dear young man, I saw you with the French Open. Great, superb, hot stuff, and you can say I said so. Will you permit one who is but 18 at Nizhny Novgorod to salute you once more? And he kissed Cuthbert Banks again. Then, brushing aside one or two intellectuals who were in the way, he dragged up a chair and sat down. You are a great man, he said. Oh, no, said Cuthbert modestly. Yeah, great, most, very. The way you lay your approach putts. Dead from anywhere. Oh, I don't know. Mr. Brusiloff drew his chair closer. Let me tell you this very funny story about putting. It was one day I play at Nizhny Novgorod with the pro against Lenin and Trotsky had a 2-inch putt from the hole. But just as he addresses the ball, someone in the crowd he tries to assassinate Lenin with a revolver. You know that is our great national sport, trying to assassinate Lenin with revolvers, and the bang puts Trotsky off his stock, and he goes 5 yards past the hole, and then Lenin, who is rather shaken, you understand, he misses again himself, and we win the hole and match, and I clean up 396,000 rubles, or 15 shillings in your money. Some Gamovich. And now let me tell you one other very funny story. Desultory conversation had begun in murmurs over the rest of the room, as the Wood Hills intellectuals politely endeavored to conceal the fact that they realized that they were about as much out of it as this reunion of twin souls as cats at a dog show. From time to time they started as Vladimir Brusilov's laugh boomed out. Perhaps it was a consolation to them to know that he was enjoying himself. As for Adeline, how shall I describe her emotions? She was stunned. Before her very eyes the stone which the builders had rejected had become the main thing. The 100-to-1 shot had walked away with the race. A rush of tender admiration for Cuthbert Banks flooded her heart. She saw that she had been all wrong. Cuthbert, whom she had always treated with a patronizing superiority, was really a man to be looked up to and worshipped. A deep, dreamy sigh shook Adeline's fragile form. Half an hour later, Vladimir and Cuthbert Banks rose. Goodbye, Mrs. Smethurst, said the celebrity. Thank you for a most charming visit. My friend Cootaboot and me, we go now to shoot a few holes. You will lend me clubs, friend Cootaboot? Any want? The Nibulusky is what I use most. Goodbye, Mrs. Smethurst. They were moving to the door when Cuthbert felt a light touch on his arm. Adeline was looking up at him tenderly. May I come too and walk round with you? Cuthbert's bosom heaved. Oh, he said, with a tremor in his voice, "that you would walk round with me for life?" Her eyes met his. "Perhaps," she whispered softly, "it could be arranged." "And so," concluded the oldest member, "you see that golf can be of the greatest practical assistance to a man in life's struggle." Raymond Parsloe Devine, who was no player, had to move out of the neighborhood immediately, and is now, I believe, writing scenarios out in California for the Flicker Film Company. Adeline is married to Cuthbert, and it was only his earnest pleading which prevented her from having their eldest son christened Abe Mitchell, ribbed face, Mashy Bang, for she is now as keen a devotee of the great game as her husband. Those who know them say that theirs is a union so devoted, so the sage broke off abruptly, for the young man had rushed to the door and out into the passage. Through the open door he could hear him crying passionately to the waiter to bring back his clubs. End of The Clicking of Cuthbert. This is a LibriVox recording.
The Opening of the Will from The Flegeljahre by Jean-Paul Richter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel Novotny. The Opening of the Will. Since Haslau had been a princely residence, no one could remember any event, the birth of their heir apparent excepted, that had been awaited with such curiosity as the opening of the Van der Kabel will. Van der Kabel might have been called the Haslau Crassus, and his life described as a pleasure-making mint, or a washing of gold sand under a golden rain, or in whatever other terms wit could devise. Now, 7 distant living relatives of 7 distant deceased relatives of Kabel were cherishing some hope of a legacy, because the Crassus had sworn to remember them. These hopes, however, were very faint. No one was especially inclined to trust him, as he not only conducted himself on all occasions in a gruffly moral and unselfish manner, in regard to morality, to be sure, the 7 relatives were still beginners, but likewise treated everything so derisively and possessed a heart so full of tricks and surprises that there was no dependence to be placed upon him. The eternal smile hovering around his temples and thick lips, and the mocking falsetto voice, impaired the good impression that might otherwise have been made by his nobly cut face and a pair of large hands, from which New Year's presents, benefit performances, and gratuities were continually falling. Wherefore the birds of passage proclaimed the man, this human mountain ash in which they nested, of whose berries they ate, to be in reality a dangerous trap, and they seemed hardly able to see the visible berries for the invisible snares. Between 2 attacks of apoplexy he made his will and deposited it with the magistrate. Though half dead when he gave over the certificate to the 7 presumptive heirs, he said in his old tone of voice that he did not wish this token of his decease to cause dejection to mature men, whom he would much rather think of as laughing than as weeping heirs. And only one of them, the coldly ironical police inspector Harprecht, answered the smilingly ironical Crassus. It was not in their power to determine the extent of their collective sympathy in such a loss. At last the 7 heirs appeared with their certificate at the city hall. These were the consistorial councillor Glantz, the police inspector, the court agent Neupeter, the attorney of the Royal Treasury Knoll, the bookseller Passvogel, the preacher at early service Flax, and Herr Flitte from Alsace. They duly and properly requested of the magistrates the charter consigned to the latter by the late Kabel, and asked for the opening of the will. The chief executor of the will was the officiating Bürgermeister in person. The under-executors were the municipal councillors. Presently the charter and the will were fetched from the council chamber into Bürgermeister's office. They were passed around to all the councillors and the heirs in order that they might see the privy seal of the city upon them, and the registry of the consignment written by the town clerk upon the charter was read aloud to the 7 heirs. Thereby it was made known to them that the charter had really been consigned to the magistrates by the late departed one, and confided to them scriptio rei publicae, likewise that he had been in his right mind on the day of consignment. The 7 seals, which he himself had placed upon it, were found to be intact. Then, after the town clerk had again drawn up a short record of all this, the will was opened in God's name and read aloud by the officiating Burgermeister. It ran as follows.
I, van der Kabel, do draw up my will on the 7th day of May 1790 here in my house in Haslau in Dog Street, without a great ado of words, although I have been both a German notary and a Dutch dominie. Notwithstanding, I believe that I am still sufficiently familiar with the notary's art to be able to act as a regular testator and bequeather of property. Testators are supposed to commence by setting forth the motives which have caused them to make their will. These with me, as with most, are my approaching death and the disposal of an inheritance which is desired by many. To talk about a funeral and such matters is too weak and silly. That which remains of me, however, may the eternal Sun above us make use of for one of his verdant springs, and not for a gloomy winter. The charitable bequests about which notaries must always inquire, I shall attend to by setting aside for 3,000 of the city paupers an equal number of florins, so that in the years to come, on the anniversary of my death, if the annual review of the troops does not happen to take place on the common that day, they can pitch their camp there and have a merry feast of the money, and afterward clothe themselves with the tent linen. To all the schoolmasters of the principality also I bequeath to every man 1 August d'or. My will being divided into clauses, this may be taken as the first. Second clause. It is the general custom for legacies and disinheritances to be counted among the most essential parts of the will. In accordance with this custom, consistorial councillor Glantz, attorney of the Royal Treasury Knoll, court agent Peter Neupeter, police inspector Habrecht, the preacher at early service Flachs, the court bookseller Passvogel, and Herr Flitte, for the time being receive nothing. Not so much because no Trebellianica is due to them as the most distant relatives, or because most of them have themselves enough to bequeath, as because I know out of their own mouths that they love my insignificant person better than my great wealth, which person I therefore leave them, little as can be got out of it.
7 preternaturally long faces at this point started up like 7 sleepers. The consistorial councillor, a man still young but celebrated throughout all Germany for his oral and printed sermons, considered himself one most insulted for such taunts. From the Alsatian Flitte there escaped an oath accompanied by a slight smack of the tongue. The chin of Flachs, the preacher at early service, grew downward into a regular beard. The city councillors could hear several softly ejaculated obituaries referring to the late Kabel under the name of scamp, fool, infidel, etc. But the officiating Burgermeister waved his hand. The attorney of the Royal Treasury and the bookseller again bent all the elastic steel springs of their faces as if setting a trap, and the Burgermeister continued to read, although with enforced seriousness.
Third clause. I make an exception of the present house in Dog Street, which after this, my third clause, shall just as it stands devolve upon and belong to that one of my 7 above named relatives, who first, before the other 6 rivals, can in 1/2 hour's time, to be reckoned from the reading of the clause, shed 1 or 2 tears over me, his departed uncle, in the presence of an estimable magistrate, who shall record the same. If, however, all eyes remain dry, then the house likewise shall fall to the exclusive heir, whom I am about to name.
Here the Burgermeister closed the will, remarked that the condition was certainly unusual but not illegal, and the court must adjudge the house to the first one who wept. With which he placed his watch, which pointed to 11:30, on the office table, and sat himself quietly down in order in his capacity of executor to observe, together with the whole court, who should first shed the desired tear over the testator. It cannot fairly be assumed that, as long as the earth had stood, a more woe-begone and muddled Congress ever met upon it than this one, composed of 7 dry provinces assembled together, as it were, in order to weep. At first, some precious minutes were spent merely in confused wondering and in smiling. The Congress had been placed too suddenly in the situation of the dog who, when about to rush angrily at his enemy, heard the latter call out, "Beg!" and who suddenly got up on his hind legs and begged, showing his teeth. From cursing, they had been pulled up too quickly into weeping. Everyone realized that genuine emotion was not to be thought of. Downpours do not come quite so much on the gallop. Such sudden baptism of the eyes was out of the question. But in 26 minutes, something might happen. The merchant Neupeter asked if it were not an accursed business and a foolish joke on the part of a sensible man, and he refused to lend himself to it. But the thought of that house, that it might swim into his purse on a tear, caused him a peculiar irritation of the glands, which made him look like a sick lark to whom a clyster is being applied with an oiled pinhead, the house being the head. The attorney of the Royal Treasury, Knoll, screwed up his face like a poor workman whom an apprentice is shaving and scraping on a Saturday evening by the light of a shoemaker's candle. He was furiously angry at the misuse made of the title will, and quite near to shedding tears of rage. The crafty bookseller Passvogel at once quietly set about the matter in hand. He hastily went over in his mind all the touching things which he was publishing at his own expense or on commission, and from which he hoped to brew something. He looked all the while like a dog that is slowly licking off the emetic which the Parisian veterinary Demey had smeared on his nose. It would evidently be some time before the desired effect would take place. Flitte from Alsace danced around in the Burgermeister's office, looked laughingly at all the serious faces, and swore he was not the richest among them, but not for all Strasbourg and Alsace besides was he capable of weeping over such a joke. At last the police inspector looked very significantly at him and declared, in case Monsieur hoped by means of laughter to squeeze the desired drops out of the well-known glands and out of my Bomian, the caruncle and others, and thus thievishly to cover himself with this window-pane moisture, he wished to remind him that he could gain just as little by it as if he should blow his nose and try to profit by that, as in the latter case it is well known that more tears flow from the eyes through the ductus nasalis than were shed in any church pew during a funeral sermon. But the Alsatian assured him he was only laughing in fun and not with serious intentions. The inspector, for his part, tried to drive something appropriate into his eyes by holding them wide open and staring fixedly. The preacher at early service, Flax, looked like a beggar riding a runaway horse. Meanwhile his heart, which was already overcast with the most promising sultry clouds caused by domestic and church troubles, could have immediately drawn up the necessary water, as easily as the sun before bad weather. If only the floating house navigating toward him had not always come between as a much too cheerful spectacle and acted as a dam. The consistorial councillor had learned to know his own nature from New Year's and funeral sermons, and was positive that he himself would be the first to be moved if only he started to make a moving address to the others. When, therefore, he saw himself and the others hanging so long on the drying line, he stood up and said with dignity, "Everyone knows who had read his printed works, knew for a certainty that he carried a heart in his breast which needed to repress such holy tokens as tears are, so as not thereby to deprive any fellow man of something, rather than laboriously to draw them to the surface with an ulterior motive. This heart has already shed them, but in secret, for Cabal was my friend," he said, and looked around. He noticed with pleasure that all were sitting there as dry as wooden corks. At this special moment, crocodiles, stags, elephants, witches, ravens could have wept more easily than the heirs. So disturbed and enraged were they by glance. Flax was the only one who had a secret inspiration. He hastily summoned to his mind Cabal's charities and the mean clothes of the grey hair of the women who formed his congregation at the early service, Lazarus with his dogs, and his own long coffin, and also the beheading of various people, Werther's sorrows, a small battlefield, and himself. How pitifully here in the days of his youth he was struggling and tormenting himself over the clause of the will. Just 3 more jerks of the pump handle, and he would have his water and the house. "Oh, Cabal, my Cabal," continued Glance, almost weeping for joy at the prospect of the approaching tears of sorrow. "When once beside your loving heart, covered with earth, my heart too shall I believe, honoured gentlemen," said Flax mournfully, arising and looking around, his eyes brimming over, "I am weeping." After which he sat down again and let them flow more cheerfully. He had feathered his nest. Under the eyes of the other heirs he had snatched away the prize house from Glance, who now extremely regretted his exertions, since he had quite uselessly talked away half of his appetite. The emotion of Flax was placed on record, and the house in Dog Street was adjudged to him for good and all. The Burgermeister was heartily glad to see the poor devil get it. It was the first time in the Principality of Haslau that the tears of a schoolmaster and teacher of the church had been metamorphosed, not like those of the Heliads, into light amber, which encased an insect, but like those of the goddess Freya, into gold. Glance congratulated Flax, and gaily drew his attention to the fact that perhaps he, Glance, had helped to move him. The rest drew aside, by their separation accentuating their position on the dry road from that of Flax on the wet. All, however, remained intent upon the rest of the will. Then the reading of it was continued. End of The Opening of the Will by Jean-Paul Richter, read by Rachel Novotny, The Black Forest, Germany.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. While the Auto Waits, a short story by O. Henry, the pen name of William Sidney Porter. Promptly at the beginning of twilight came again in that quiet corner of that quiet small park the girl in grey. She sat upon a bench and read a book, for there was yet to come a half hour in which print could be accomplished. To repeat, her dress was grey and plain enough to mark its impeccancy of style and fit. A large meshed veil imprisoned her turban hat and a face that shone through it with a calm and unconscious beauty. She had come there at the same hour on the day previous, and on the day before that, and there was one who knew it. The young man who knew it hovered near, relying upon burnt sacrifices to the great joss Luck. His piety was rewarded, for, in turning a page, her book slipped from her fingers and bounded from the bench a full yard away. The young man pounced upon it with instant avidity, returning it to its owner with that air that seems to flourish in parks and public places, a compound of gallantry and hope, tempered with respect for the policeman on the beat. In a pleasant voice he risked an inconsequent remark upon the weather, that introductory topic responsible for so much of the world's unhappiness, and stood poised for a moment, awaiting his fate. The girl looked him over leisurely, at his ordinary neat dress and his features distinguished by nothing particular in the way of expression. "You may sit down if you like," she said, in a full, deliberate contralto. "Really, I would like to have you do so. The light is too bad for reading. I would prefer to talk." The vassal of Luck slid upon the seat by her side with complaisance. "Oh, do you know," he said, speaking the formula with which park chairmen open their meetings, "that you are quite the stunningest girl I have seen in a long time. I had my eye on you yesterday. Didn't know somebody was bowled over by those pretty lamps of yours, did you, honeysuckle?" "Whoever you are," said the girl in icy tones, "you must remember that I am a lady. I will excuse the remark you have just made, because the mistake was, doubtless, not an unnatural one, in your circle. I asked you to sit down. If the invitation must constitute me your honeysuckle, consider it withdrawn." "I earnestly beg your pardon," pleaded the young man. His expression of satisfaction had changed to one of penitence and humility. "It was my fault, you know. I mean, there are girls in parks, you know. That is, of course, you don't know, but—" "Abandon the subject, if you please. Of course I know. Now tell me about these people passing and crowding each way along these paths. Where are they going? Why do they hurry so? Are they happy?" The young man had promptly abandoned his air of coquetry. His cue was now for a waiting part. He could not guess the role he would be expected to play. "It is interesting to watch them," he replied, postulating her mood. "It is the wonderful drama of life. Some are going to supper, and some to other places. One wonders what their histories are." "I do not," said the girl. "I am not so inquisitive. I come here to sit, because here only can I be near the great, common, throbbing heart of humanity. My part in life is cast where its beats are never felt. Can you surmise why I spoke to you, Mr. "Parkenstacker," supplied the young man. Then he looked eager and hopeful. "No," said the girl, holding up a slender finger and smiling slightly. "You would recognize it immediately. It is impossible to keep one's name out of print, or even one's portrait. This veil and this hat of my maid furnish me with an incog. You should have seen the chauffeur stare at it when he thought I did not see. Candidly, there are 5 or 6 names that belong in the Holy of Holies, and mine, by the accident of birth, is one of them. I spoke to you, Mr. Stankenpot—" "Parkenstacker," corrected the young man modestly. "Mr. Parkenstacker, because I wanted to talk, for once, with a natural man, one unspoiled by the despicable gloss of wealth and supposed social superiority. Oh, you do not know how weary I am of it. Money, money, money! And of the men who surround me, dancing like little marionettes, all cut by the same pattern. I am sick of pleasure, of jewels, of travel, of society, of luxuries of all kinds." "I always had an idea," ventured the young man, hesitatingly, "that money must be a pretty good thing." "A competence is to be desired. But when you have so many millions that—" She concluded the sentence with a gesture of despair. "It is the monotony of it," she continued, "that palls. Drives, dinners, theatres, balls, suppers, with the gilding of superfluous wealth over it all. Sometimes the very tinkle of the ice in my champagne glass nearly drives me mad." Mr. Parkenstacker looked ingenuously interested. "I have always liked," he said, "to read and hear about the ways of wealthy and fashionable folks. I suppose I'm a bit of a snob, but I like to have my information accurate. Now, I had formed the opinion that champagne is cooled in the bottle and not by placing ice in the glass." The girl gave a musical laugh of genuine amusement. "You should know," she explained, in an indulgent tone, "that we of the non-useful class depend for our amusement upon departure from precedent. Just now it is a fad to put ice in champagne. The idea was originated by a visiting Prince of Tartary while dining at the Waldorf. It will soon give way to some other whim, just as, at a dinner party this week on Madison Avenue, a green kid glove was laid by the plate of each guest, to be put on and used while eating olives." "I see," admitted the young man humbly. "These special diversions of the inner circle do not become familiar to the common public. Sometimes," continued the girl, acknowledging his confession of error by a slight bow, "I have thought that if ever I should love a man it would be one of lowly station, one who is a worker and not a drone. But, doubtless, the claims of caste and wealth will prove stronger than the inclination. Just now I am besieged by two. One is a Grand Duke of a German principality. I think he has, or has had, a wife somewhere, driven mad by his intemperance and cruelty. The other is an English marquis, so cold and mercenary that I even prefer the diabolism of the Duke. What is it that impels me to tell you these things, Mr. Parkenstacker?" "Parkenstacker," breathed the young man. "Indeed, you cannot know how much I appreciate your confidences." The girl contemplated him with a calm, impersonal regard that befitted the difference in their stations. "What is your line of business, Mr. Parkenstacker?" she asked. "A very humble one. But I hope to rise in the world. Were you really in earnest when you said that you could love a man of lowly position?" "Indeed I was. But I said 'might.' There is the Grand Duke and the Marquis, you know. Yes, no calling could be too humble, were the man what I would wish him to be." "I work," declared Mr. Parkenstacker, "in a restaurant." The girl shrank slightly. "Not as a waiter," she said, a little imploringly. "Labour is noble, but personal attendants, you know, valets and—" "I am not a waiter. I am cashier in—" On the street they faced that bounded the opposite side of the park was the brilliant electric sign, "Restaurant." "I am cashier in that restaurant you see there." The girl consulted a tiny watch set in a bracelet of rich design upon her left wrist, and rose hurriedly. She thrust her book into a glittering reticule suspended from her waist, for which, however, the book was too large. "Why are you not at work?" she asked. "I am on the night turn," said the young man. "It is yet an hour before my period begins. May I not hope to see you again?" "I do not know. Perhaps; but the whim may not seize me again. I must go quickly now. There is a dinner, and a box at the play, and oh, the same old round. Perhaps you noticed an automobile at the upper corner of the park as you came, one with a white body." "And red running gear?" asked the young man, knitting his brows reflectively. "Yes, I always come in that. Pierre waits for me there. He supposes me to be shopping in the department store across the square. Conceive of the bondage of life, wherein we must deceive even our chauffeurs. Good night." "But it is dark now," said Mr. Parkenstacker, "and the park is full of rude men. May I not walk—" "If you have the slightest regard for my wishes," said the girl firmly, "you will remain at this bench for 10 minutes after I have left. I do not mean to accuse you, but you are probably aware that autos generally bear the monogram of their owner. Again, good night." Swift and stately she moved away through the park. The young man watched her graceful form as she reached the pavement at the park's edge, and turned up along it towards the corner where the automobile stood. Then he treacherously and unhesitatingly began to dodge and skim among the park trees and shrubbery, in a course parallel to her route, keeping her well in sight. When she reached the corner, she turned her head to glance at the motor car, and then passed it, continuing on across the street. Sheltered behind a convenient standing cab, the young man followed her movements closely with his eyes. Passing down the sidewalk of the street opposite the park, she entered the restaurant with the blazing sign. The place was one of those frankly glaring establishments, all white paint and glass, where one may dine cheaply and conspicuously. The girl penetrated the restaurant to some retreat at its rear, whence she quickly emerged without her hat and veil. The cashier's desk was well to the front. A red-haired girl on the stool climbed down, glancing pointedly at the clock as she did so. The girl in gray mounted in her place. The young man thrust his hands into his pockets and walked slowly back along the sidewalk. At the corner his foot struck a small paper-covered volume lying there, sending it sliding to the edge of the turf. By its picturesque cover he recognized it as the book the girl had been reading. He picked it up carelessly, and saw that its title was New Arabian Nights, the author being of the name of Stevenson. He dropped it again upon the grass, and lounged, irresolute, for a minute. Then he stepped into the automobile, reclined upon the cushions, and said 2 words to the chauffeur. "Club, Henri." The end of the recording of While the Auto Waits by O. Henry.
An Idyll of London by Beatrice Harraden. It was 1 o'clock, and many of the students in the National Gallery had left off work and were refreshing themselves with lunch and conversation. There was one old worker who had not stirred from his place, but he had put down his brush and had taken from his pocket a small book, which was like its owner, thin and shabby of covering. He seemed to find pleasure in reading it, for he turned over its pages with all the tenderness characteristic of one who loves what he reads. Now and again he glanced at his unfinished copy of the beautiful portrait of Andrea del Sarto, and once his eyes rested on another copy next to his, better and truer than his, and once he stopped to pick up a girl's prune-coloured tie, which had fallen from the neighbouring easel. After this he seemed to become unconscious of his surroundings, as unconscious indeed as any one of the pictures near him. Any one might have been justified in mistaking him for the portrait of a man, but that his lips moved, for it was his custom to read softly to himself. The students passed back to their places, not troubling to notice him, because they knew from experience that he never noticed them, and that all greetings were wasted on him, and all words were wanton expenditure of breath. They had come to regard him very much in the same way as many of us regard the wonders of nature, without astonishment, without any questionings, and often without any interest. One girl, a newcomer, did chance to say to her companion, "How ill that old man looks!" "Oh, he always looks like that," was the answer. "You soon get accustomed to him. Come along, I must finish my blind beggar this afternoon." In a few minutes most of the workers were busy again, although there were some who continued to chat quietly, and several young men who seemed reluctant to leave their girl friends, and who were by no means encouraged to go. One young man came to claim his book and pipe, which he had left in the charge of a bright-eyed girl who was copying Sir Joshua's Angels. She gave him his treasures, and received in exchange a dark red rose, which she fastened in her belt. And then he returned to his portrait of Mrs. Siddons. But there was something in his disconsolate manner which made one suspect that he thought less of Mrs. Siddons's beauty than of the beauty of the girl who was wearing the dark red rose. The strangers, strolling through the rooms, stopped now and again to peer curiously at the students' work. They were stared at indignantly by the students themselves, but they made no attempt to move away, and even ventured sometimes to pass criticisms of no tender character on some of the copies. The fierce-looking man who was copying the Horse Fair deliberately put down his brushes, folded his arms, and waited defiantly until they had gone by. But others, wiser in their generation, went on painting calmly. Several workers were painting the new Raphael. One of them was a white-haired old gentlewoman whose hand was trembling, and yet skilful still. More than once she turned to give a few hints to the young girl near her, who looked in some distress and doubt. Just the needful help was given, and then the girl plied her brush merrily, smiling the while with pleasure and gratitude. There seemed to be a genial, kindly influence at work, a certain homeliness, too, which must needs assert itself where many are gathered together, working side by side. All made a harmony, the wonderful pictures, collected from many lands and many centuries, each with its meaning and its message from the past, the ever-present memories of the painters themselves, who had worked and striven and conquered, and the living human beings, each with his wealth of earnest endeavour and hope. Meanwhile the old man read on uninterruptedly until two hands were put over his book and a gentle voice said, "Mr. Lindole, you have had no lunch again. Do you know, I begin to hate Lucretius. He always makes you forget your food." The old man looked up, and something like a smile passed over his joyless face when he saw Helen Stanley bending over him. "Ah," he answered, "you must not hate Lucretius. I have had more pleasant hours with him than with any living person." He rose and came forward to examine her copy of Andrea del Sarto's portrait. "Yours is better than mine," he said critically. "In fact, mine is a failure. I think I shall only get a small price for mine. Indeed, I doubt whether I shall get sufficient to pay for my funeral." "You speak dismally," she answered, smiling. "I missed you yesterday," he continued, half dreamily. "I left my work and I wandered through the rooms, and I did not even read Lucretius. Something seemed to have gone from my life. At first I thought it must be my favourite Raphael, or the Murillo, but it was neither the one nor the other. It was you. That was strange, wasn't it? But you know we get accustomed to anything, and perhaps I should have missed you less the second day, and by the end of the week I should not have missed you at all. Mercifully, we have in us the power of forgetting." "I do not wish to plead for myself," she said, "but I do not believe that you or any one could really forget. That which outsiders call forgetfulness might be called by the better name of resignation. I don't care about talking any more now," he said suddenly, and he went to his easel and worked silently at the picture, and Helen Stanley glanced at him and thought she had never seen her old companion look so forlorn and desolate as he did to-day. He looked as if no gentle hand had ever been placed on him in kindliness and affection, and that seemed to her a terrible thing, for she was one of those prehistorically minded persons who persist in believing that affection is as needful to human life as rain to flower life. When first she came to work at the gallery, some 12 months ago, she had noticed this old man, and had wished for his companionship. She was herself lonely and sorrowful, and, although young, had to fight her own battles, and she had learned something of the difficulties of fighting, and this had given her an experience beyond her years. She was not more than 24 years of age, but she looked rather older, and, though she had beautiful eyes, full of meaning and kindness, her features were decidedly plain as well as unattractive. There were some in the gallery who said among themselves that, as Mr. Lindole had waited so many years before talking to anyone, he might have chosen someone better worth the waiting for. But they soon became accustomed to seeing Helen Stanley and Mr. Lindole together, and they laughed less than before, and meanwhile the acquaintance ripened into a sort of friendship, half sulky on his part, and wholly kind on her part. He told her nothing about himself, and he asked nothing about herself. For weeks he never even knew her name. Sometimes he did not speak at all, and the two friends would work silently side by side until it was time to go, and then he waited until she was ready, and walked with her across Trafalgar Square, where they parted and went their own ways. But occasionally, when she least expected it, he would speak with glowing enthusiasm on art. Then his eyes seemed to become bright, and his bent figure more erect, and his whole bearing proud and dignified. There were times, too, when he would speak on other subjects, on the morality of free thought, on Bruno, of blessed memory, on him, and scores of others too.
He would speak of the different schools of philosophy. He would laugh at himself and at all who, having given time and thought to the study of life's complicated problems, had not reached one step further than the old world thinkers. Perhaps he would quote one of his favourite philosophers, and then suddenly relapse into silence, returning to his wonted abstraction and his indifference to his surroundings. Helen Stanley had learned to understand his ways and to appreciate his mind, and, without intruding on him in any manner, had put herself gently into his life as his quiet champion and his friend. No one in her presence dared speak slightingly of the old man, or to make fun of his tumble-down appearance, or of his worn-out silk hat with a crack in the side, or of his rag of a black tie, which, together with his overcoat, had seen better days. Once she brought her needle and thread and darned the torn sleeve during her lunch-time, and, though he never knew it, it was a satisfaction to her to have helped him. To-day she noticed that he was painting badly, and that he seemed to take no interest in his work. But she went on busily with her own picture, and was so engrossed in it that she did not at first observe that he had packed up his brushes and was preparing to go home. "3 more strokes," he said quietly, "and you will have finished your picture. I shall never finish mine. Perhaps you will be good enough to set it right for me. I am not coming here again. I don't seem to have caught the true expression. What do you think? I am not going to let it worry me, for I am sure you will promise to do your best for me. See, I will hand over these colours and these brushes to you, and no doubt you will accept the palette as well. I have no further use for it." Helen Stanley took the palette, which he held out toward her, and looked at him as though she would wish to question him. "It is very hot here," he continued, "and I am going out. I am tired of work." He hesitated, and then added, "I should like you to come with me if you can spare the time." She packed up her things at once, and the two friends moved slowly away, he gazing absently at the pictures, and she wondering in her mind as to the meaning of his strange mood. When they were on the steps inside the building, he turned to Helen Stanley and said, "I should like to go back to the pictures once more. I feel as if I must stand among them just a little longer. They have been my companions for so long that they are almost part of myself. I can close my eyes and recall them faithfully. But I want to take a last look at them. I want to feel once more the presence of the great masters, and to refresh my mind with their genius. When I look at their work I think of their life, and can only wonder at their death. It was so strange that they should die." They went back together, and he took her to his favourite pictures, but remained speechless before them, and she did not disturb his thoughts. At last he said, "I am ready to go. I have said farewell to them all. I know nothing more wonderful than being among a number of fine pictures. It is almost overwhelming. One expects nature to be grand, but one does not expect man to be grand." "You know we don't agree there," she answered. "I expect everything grand and great from man." They went out of the gallery and into Trafalgar Square. It was a scorching afternoon in August, but there was some cooling comfort in seeing the dancing water of the fountains, sparkling so brightly in the sunshine. "Do you mind stopping here a few minutes?" he said. "I should like to sit down and watch. There is so much to see." She led the way to a seat, one end of which was occupied by a workman who was sleeping soundly, and snoring too, his arms folded tightly together. He had a little clay pipe in the corner of his mouth. It seemed to be tucked in so snugly that there was not much danger of its falling to the ground. At last Helen spoke to her companion. "What do you mean by saying that you will not be able to finish your picture? Perhaps you are not well. Indeed, you don't look well. You make me anxious, for I have a great regard for you." "I am ill and suffering," he answered quietly. "I thought I should have died yesterday, but I made up my mind to live until I saw you again. I thought I would ask you to spend the afternoon with me, and go with me to Westminster Abbey, and sit with me in the cloisters. I do not feel able to go by myself, and I know of no one to ask except you, and I believe you would not refuse me, for you have been very kind to me. I do not quite understand why you have been kind to me, but I am wonderfully grateful to you. Today I heard someone in the gallery say that you were plain. I turned round and I said, 'I beg your pardon, I think she is very beautiful.' I think they laughed, and that puzzled me, for you have always seemed to me a very beautiful person." At that moment the little clay pipe fell from the workman's mouth and was broken into bits. He awoke with a start, gazed stupidly at the old man and his companion, and at the broken clay pipe. "Curse my luck," he said, yawning. "I was fond of that damned little pipe." The old man drew his own pipe and his own tobacco pouch from his pocket. "Take these, stranger," he said. "I don't want them, and good luck to you." The man's face brightened up as he took the pipe and pouch. "You're uncommon kind," he said. "Can you spare them?" he added, holding them out half reluctantly. "Yes," answered the old man. "I shall not smoke again. You may as well have these matches too." The labourer put them in his pocket, smiled his thanks, and walked some little distance off, and Helen watched him examine his new pipe, and then fill it with tobacco and light it. Mr. Lindole proposed that they should be getting on their way to Westminster, and they soon found themselves in the Abbey. They sat together in the Poet's Corner. A smile of quiet happiness broke over the old man's tired face as he looked around and took in all the solemn beauty and grandeur of the resting place of the great. "You know," he said, half to himself, half to his companion, "I have no belief of any kind, and no hopes and no fears, but all through my life it has been a comfort to me to sit quietly in a church or a cathedral. The graceful arches, the sun shining through the stained windows, the vaulted roof, the noble columns, have helped me to understand the mystery which all our books of philosophy cannot make clear, though we bend over them year after year, and grow old over them, old in age and in spirit. Though I myself have never been outwardly a worshipper, I have never sat in a place of worship but that, for a time being, I have felt a better man. But directly the voice of doctrine or dogma was raised, the spell was broken for me, and that which I hoped was being made clear had no further meaning for me. There was only one voice which ever helped me, the voice of the organ, arousing me, thrilling me, filling me with strange longing, with welcome sadness, with solemn gladness. I have always thought that music can give an answer when everything else is of no avail. I do not know what you believe." "I am so young to have found out," she said, almost pleadingly. "Don't worry yourself," he answered kindly. "Be brave and strong, and let the rest go. I should like to live long enough to see what you will make of your life. I believe you will never be false to yourself or to anyone. That is rare. I believe you will not let any lower ideal take the place of your high ideal of what is beautiful and noble in art, in life. I believe that you will never let despair get the upper hand of you. If it does, you may as well die. Yes, you may as well. And I entreat you not to lose your entire faith in humanity. There is nothing like that for withering up the very core of the heart. I tell you, humanity and nature have so much in common with each other that if you lose part of your pleasure in the latter, you will see less beauty in the trees, the flowers, and the fields, less grandeur in the mighty mountains and the sea. The seasons will come and go, and you will scarcely heed their coming and going. Winter will settle over your soul just as it settled over mine, and you see what I am." They had now passed into the cloisters, and they sat down in one of the recesses of the windows, and looked out upon the rich plot of grass which the cloisters enclose. There was not a soul there except themselves. The cool and the quiet and the beauty of the spot refreshed these pilgrims, and they rested in calm enjoyment. Helen was the first to break the silence. "I am so glad you have brought me here," she said. "I shall never grumble now at not being able to afford a fortnight in the country. This is better than anything else." "It has always been my summer holiday to come here," he said. "When I first came I was like you, young and hopeful, and I had wonderful visions of what I intended to do and to be. Here it was I made a vow that I would become a great painter, and win for myself a resting place in this very abbey. There is humour in the situation, is there not?" "I don't like to hear you say that," she answered. "It is not always possible for us to fill all our ambitions. Still, it is better to have them and failed of them than not to have them at all." "Possibly," he replied coldly. Then he added, "I wish you would tell me about yourself. You have always interested me." "I have nothing to tell you about myself," she answered frankly. "I am alone in the world, without friends and without relations. The very name I use is not a real name. I was a foundling. At times I am sorry I do not belong to anyone, and at other times I am glad. You know I am fond of books and of art, so my life is not altogether empty, and I find my pleasure in hard work. When I saw you at the gallery I wished to know you, and I asked one of the students who you were. He told me you were a misanthrope. Then I did not care so much about knowing you, until one day you spoke to me about my painting, and that was the beginning of our friendship. 40 years ago," he said sadly, "the friend of my boyhood deceived me. I had not thought it possible that he could be false to me. He screened himself behind me, and became prosperous and respected at the expense of my honor. I vowed I would never again make a friend. A few years later, when I was beginning to hold up my head, the woman whom I loved deceived me. Then I put from me all affection and all love. Greater natures than mine are better able to bear these troubles, but my heart contracted and withered up." He paused for a moment, many recollections overpowering him. Then he went on telling her the history of his life, unfolding to her the story of his hopes and ambitions, describing to her the very home where he was born, and the dark-eyed sister whom he had loved, and with whom he had played over the daisied fields, and through the carpeted woods, and all among the richly tinted bracken. One day he was told she was dead, and that he must never speak her name. But he spoke it all the day and all the night. Beryl, nothing but Beryl. And he looked for her in the fields and in the woods and among the bracken. It seemed as if he had unlocked the casket of his heart, closed for so many years, and as if all the memories of the past and all the secrets of his life were rushing out, glad to be free once more, and grateful for the open air of sympathy. "Beryl was as swift as a deer," he exclaimed. "You would have laughed to see her on the moor. Ah, it was hard to give up all the thoughts of meeting her again. They told me I should see her in heaven, but I did not care about heaven. I wanted Beryl on earth, as I knew her, a merry, laughing sister. I think you are right. We don't forget. We become resigned in a dead, dull kind of way." Suddenly he said, "I don't know why I have told you all this, and yet it has been such a pleasure to me. You are the only person to whom I could have spoken about myself, for no one else but you would have cared." "Don't you think," she said gently, "that you made a mistake in letting your experiences embitter you? Because you had been unlucky in one or two instances, it did not follow that all the world was against you. Perhaps you unconsciously put yourself against all the world, and therefore saw everyone in an unfavourable light. It seems so easy to do that. Trouble comes to most people, doesn't it? And your philosophy should have taught you to make the best of it. At least, that is my notion of the value of philosophy." She spoke hesitatingly, as though she gave utterance to these words against her will. "I am sure you are right, child," he said eagerly. He put his hands to his eyes, but he could not keep back the tears. "I have been such a lonely old man," he sobbed. "No one can tell what a lonely, loveless life mine has been. If I were not so old and so tired, I should like to begin all over again." He sobbed for many minutes, and she did not know what to say to him of comfort. But she took his hand within her own, and gently caressed it, as one might do to a little child in pain. He looked up and smiled through his tears. "You have been very good to me," he said, "and I dare say you have thought me ungrateful. You mended my coat for me one morning, and not a day has passed but that I have looked at that darn and thought of you. I like to remember that you had done it for me, but you have done far more than this for me. You have put some sweetness into my life. Whatever becomes of me hereafter, I shall never be able to think of my life on earth as anything but beautiful, because you thought kindly of me and acted kindly for me. The other night, when this terrible pain came over me, I wished you were near me. I wished to hear your voice. There is very beautiful music in your voice." "I would have come to you gladly," she said, smiling quietly at him. "You must make a promise that when you feel ill again you will send for me. Then you will see what a splendid nurse I am, and how soon you will become strong and well under my care, strong enough to paint many more pictures, each one better than the last. Now, will you promise?" "Yes," he said, and he raised her hand reverently to his lips. "You are not angry with me for doing that?" he asked suddenly. "I should not like to vex you." "I am not vexed," she answered kindly. "Then perhaps I may kiss it once more?" he asked. "Yes," she answered, and again he raised her hand to his lips. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That was kind of you. Do you see that broken sun ray yonder? Is it not golden? I find it very pleasant to sit here, and I am quite happy and almost free from pain. Lately I have been troubled with a dull thudding pain in my heart, but now I feel so strong that I believe I shall finish that Andrea del Sarto after all." "Of course you will," she answered cheerily, "and I shall have to confess that yours is better than mine. I am willing to yield the palm to you." "I must alter the expression of the mouth," he replied. "That is the part which has worried me. I don't think I told you that I have had a commission to copy Rembrandt's Old Jew. I must set to work on that next week." "But you have given me your palette and brushes," she laughed. "You must be generous enough to lend them to me," he said, smiling. "By the way, I intend to give you my books, all of them. Some day I must show them to you. I especially value my philosophical books. They have been my faithful companions through many years." "I believe you do not read Greek. That is a pity, because you would surely enjoy Aristotle. I think I must teach you Greek. It would be an agreeable legacy to leave you when I pass away into the great silence." "I should like to learn," she said, wondering to hear him speak so unreservedly. It seemed as if some vast barrier had been rolled aside, and as if she were getting to know him better, having been allowed to glance into his past life, to sympathize with his past mistakes, and with the failure of his ambitions, and with the deadening of his heart. "You must read Aeschylus," he continued enthusiastically, "and, if I mistake not, the Agamemnon will be an epoch in your life. You will find that all these studies will serve to ennoble your art, and you will be able to put mind into your work, and not merely form and colour. Do you know, I feel so well that I believe I shall not only live to finish Andrea del Sarto, but also to smoke another pipe." "You have been too rash to day," she laughed, "giving away your pipe and pouch, your palette and brushes, in this reckless manner. I must get you a new pipe to morrow. I wonder you did not part with your venerable Lucretius." "That reminds me," he said, fumbling in his pocket. "I think I have dropped my Lucretius. I fancy I left it somewhere in the Poet's Corner. It would grieve me to lose that book." "Let me go and look for it," she said, and she advanced a few steps, and then came back to him. "You have been saying many kind words to me," she said, and she put her hand on his arm, "and I have not told you that I value your friendship, and am grateful to you for letting me be more than a mere stranger to you. I have been very lonely in my life, for I am not one to make friends easily, and it has been a great privilege to me to talk with you. I want you to know this, for if I have not been anything to you, you have been a great deal to me. I have never met with much sympathy from those of my own age. I have found them narrow and unyielding, and they found me dull and uninteresting. They had passed through few experiences, and knew nothing about failure or success, and some of them did not even understand the earnestness of endeavour, and laughed at me when I spoke of a high ideal. So I withdrew into myself, and should probably have grown still more isolated than I was before, but that I met you, and as time went on we became friends. I shall always remember your teaching, and I will try to keep to a high ideal of life and art and endeavour, and I will not let despair creep into my heart, and I will not lose my faith in humanity." As she spoke, a lingering ray of sunshine lit up her face and gently caressed her soft brown hair. Slight though her form, sombre her clothes, and unlovely her features, she seemed a gracious presence because of her earnestness. "Now," she said cheerily, "you rest here until I come back with your Lucretius, and then I think I must be getting on my way home. But you must fix a time for our first Greek lesson, for we must begin to morrow." When she had gone, he walked in the cloisters, holding his hat in his hand and his stick under his arm. There was a quiet smile on his face, which was called forth by pleasant thoughts in his mind, and he did not look quite so shrunken and shrivelled as usual. His eyes were fixed on the ground, but he raised them and observed a white cat creeping toward him. It came and rubbed itself against his foot, and, purring with all its might, seemed determined to win some kind of notice from him. The old man stooped down to stroke him, and was just touching its sleek coat when he suddenly withdrew his hand and groaned deeply. He struggled to the recess and sank back. The stick fell on the stone with a clatter, and the battered hat rolled down beside it, and the white cat fled away in terror. But realizing that there was no cause for alarm, it came back and crouched near the silent figure of the old man, watching him intently. Then it stretched out its paw and played with his hand, doing its utmost to coax him into a little fun. But he would not be coaxed, and the cat lost all patience with him and left him to himself. Meanwhile Helen Stanley was looking for the lost Lucretius in the Poets' Corner. She found it laying near Chaucer's tomb, and was just going to take it to her friend when she saw the workman to whom they had spoken in Trafalgar Square. He recognized her at once and came toward her. "I've been having a quiet half hour here," he said. "It does me a sight good to sit in the Abbey." "You should go into the cloisters," she said kindly. "I have been sitting there with my friend. He will be interested to hear that you love this beautiful Abbey." "I should like to see him again," said the workman. "He has a kind way about him, and that pipe he gave me is an uncommon good one. Still, I am sorry I smashed the little clay pipe. I'd grown used to it. I'd smoked it ever since my little girl died and left me alone in the world. I used to bring my little girl here, and now I come alone. But it isn't the same thing." "No, it could not be the same thing," said Helen gently. "But you find some comfort here?" "Some little comfort," he answered. "One can't expect much." They went together into the cloisters, and as they came near the recess where the old man rested, Helen said, "Why, he has fallen asleep. He must have been very tired. And he has dropped his hat and stick. Thank you. If you will put them down there, I will watch by his side until he wakes up. I don't suppose he will sleep for long." The workman stooped down to pick up the hat and stick, and glanced at the sleeper. Something in the sleeper's countenance arrested his attention. He turned to the girl and saw that she was watching him. "What is it?" she asked anxiously. "What is the matter with you?" He tried to speak, but his voice failed him, and all he could do was to point with trembling hand at the old man. Helen looked, and a loud cry broke from her lips. The old man was dead. End of An Idyll of London, by Beatrice Harraden. Read by Lynn Thompson.
A Walk Up the Avenue by Richard Harding Davis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. A Walk Up the Avenue by Richard Harding Davis. He came down the steps slowly and pulling mechanically at his gloves. He remembered afterwards that some woman's face had nodded brightly to him from a passing brougham, and that he had lifted his hat through force of habit and without knowing who she was. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and stood for a moment uncertainly, and then turned toward the north, not because he had any definite goal in his mind, but because the other way led toward his rooms, and he did not want to go there yet. He was conscious of a strange feeling of elation, which he attributed to his being free, and to the fact that he was his own master again in everything. And with this he confessed to a distinct feeling of littleness, of having acted meanly or unworthily of himself or of her. And yet he had behaved well, even quixotically. He had tried to leave the impression with her that it was her wish and that she had broken with him, not he with her. He held a man who threw a girl over as something contemptible, and he certainly did not want to appear to himself in that light, or, for her sake, that people should think he had tired of her, or found her wanting in any one particular. He knew only too well how people would talk, how they would say he had never really cared for her, that he didn't know his own mind when he had proposed to her, and that it was a great deal better for her as it is than if he had grown out of humor with her later. As to their saying she had jilted him, he didn't mind that. He much preferred they should take that view of it, and he was chivalrous enough to hope she would think so too. He was walking slowly and had reached 30th Street. A great many young girls and women had bowed to him or nodded from the passing carriages, but it did not tend to disturb the measure of his thoughts. He was used to having people put themselves out to speak to him. Everybody made a point of knowing him, not because he was so very handsome and well-looking, and an over-popular youth, but because he was as yet unspoiled by it. But in any event, he concluded it was a miserable business. Still, he had only done what was right. He had seen it coming on for a month now, and how much better it was that they should separate now than later, or that they should have had to live separated in all but location for the rest of their lives. Yes, he had done the right thing, decidedly the only thing to do. He was still walking up the avenue and had reached 32nd Street, at which point his thoughts received a sudden turn. A half dozen men in a club window nodded to him and brought to him sharply what he was going back to. He had dropped out of their lives as entirely of late as though he had been living in a distant city. When he had met them, he had found their company uninteresting and unprofitable. He had wondered how he had ever cared for that sort of thing, and where had been the pleasure of it. Was he going back now to the gossip of that window, to the heavy discussions of traps and horses, to late breakfasts and early suppers? Must he listen to their congratulations on his being one of them again? And must he guess at their whispered conjectures as to how soon it would be before he again took up the chains and harness of their fashion? He struck the pavement sharply with his stick. No, he was not going back. She had taught him to find amusement and occupation in many things that were better and higher than any pleasures or pursuits he had known before, and he could not give them up. He had her to thank for that at least, and he would give her credit for it too, and gratefully. He would always remember it, and he would show in his way of living the influence and the good effects of these 3 months in which they had been continually together. He had reached 42nd Street now. Well, it was over with. and he would get to work at something or other. This experience had shown him that he was not meant for marriage, that he was intended to live alone, because if he found that a girl as lovely as she undeniably was palled on him after 3 months, it was evident that he would never live through life with any other one. Yes, he would always be a bachelor. He had lived his life, had told his story at the age of 25, and would wait patiently for the end, a marked and gloomy man. He would travel now and see the world. He would go to that hotel in Cairo she was always talking about, where they were to have gone on their honeymoon, or he might strike further into Africa and come back bronzed and worn with long marches and jungle fever, and with his hair prematurely white. He even considered himself with great self-pity, returning and finding her married and happy, of course. And he enjoyed, in anticipation, the secret doubts she would have of her later choice when she heard on all sides praise of this distinguished traveler. And he pictured himself meeting her reproachful glances with fatherly friendliness, and presenting her husband with tiger skins, and buying her children extravagant presents. This was at 45th Street. Yes, that was decidedly the best thing to do, to go away and improve himself, and study up all those painters and cathedrals with which she was so hopelessly conversant. He remembered how out of it she had once made him feel, and how secretly he had admired her when she had referred to a modern painting as looking like those in the long gallery of the Louvre. He thought he knew all about the Louvre, but he would go over again and locate that long gallery, and become able to talk to her understandingly about it. And then it came over him like a blast of icy air that he could never talk over things with her again. He had reached 55th Street now, and the shock brought him to a standstill on the corner, where he stood gazing blankly before him. He felt rather weak physically, and decided to go back to his rooms. And then he pictured how cheerless they would look, and how little of comfort they contained. He had used them only to dress and sleep in of late, and the distaste with which he regarded the idea that he must go back to them to read and sit and live in them showed him how utterly his life had become bound up with a house on 27th Street. Where was he to go in the evening? He asked himself with pathetic hopelessness. Or in the morning or afternoon, for that matter. Were there to be no more of those journeys to picture galleries and to the big publishing houses where they used to hover over the new book counter and pull the books about and make each other innumerable presents of daintily bound volumes, until the clerks grew to know them so well that they never went through the form of asking where the books were to be sent? And those tête-à-tête luncheons at her house, when her mother was upstairs with a headache or a dressmaker, and the long rides and walks in the park in the afternoon, and the rush downtown to dress, only to return to dine with them 10 minutes late always, and always with some new excuse, which was allowed if it was clever, and frowned at if it was commonplace. Was all this really over? Why, the town had only run on because she was in it. And as he walked the streets, the very shop windows had suggested her to him. Florists only existed that he might send her flowers, and gowns and bonnets in the milliners' windows were only pretty as they would become her, and as for the theatres and the newspapers, they were only worth while as they gave her pleasure. And he had given all this up. And for what? He asked himself. And why? He could not answer that now. it was simply because he had been surfeited with too much content. He replied passionately. He had not appreciated how happy he had been. She had been too kind, too gracious. He had never known until he had quarreled with her and lost her how precious and dear she had been to him. He was at the entrance to the park now, and he strode on along the walk, bitterly upbraiding himself for being worse than a criminal, a fool, a common blind mortal to whom a goddess had stooped. He remembered with bitter regret a turn off the drive into which they had wandered one day, a secluded pretty spot with a circle of box around it, and into the turf of which he had driven his stick, and claimed it for them both by the right of discovery. And he recalled how they had used to go there, just out of sight of their friends in the ride, and sit and chatter on a green bench beneath a bush of box, like any nursery maid and her young man, while her groom stood at the brougham door in the bridle path beyond. He had broken off a sprig of the box one day and given it to her, and she had kissed it foolishly and laughed and hidden it in the folds of her riding skirt, in burlesque fear lest the guards should arrest them for breaking the much advertised ordinance. And he remembered with a miserable smile how she had delighted him with her account of her adventure to her mother, and described them as fleeing down the avenue with their treasure, pursued by a squadron of mounted policemen. This and 100 other of the foolish, happy fancies they had shared in common came back to him, and he remembered how she had stopped one cold afternoon just outside of this favorite spot, beside an open iron grating sunk in the path, into which the rain had washed the autumn leaves, and pretended it was a steam radiator, and held her slim gloved hands out over it as if to warm them. How absurdly happy she used to make him, and how light-hearted she had been. He determined suddenly and sentimentally to go to that secret place now and bury the engagement ring she had handed back to him under that bush, as he had buried his hopes of happiness. And he pictured how some day, when he was dead, she would read of this in his will, and go and dig up the ring, and remember and forgive him. He struck off from the walk, across the turf straight toward this dell, taking the ring from his waistcoat pocket and clinching it in his hand. He was walking quickly, with rapt interest in this idea of abnegation, when he noticed, unconsciously at first, and then with a start, the familiar outlines and colors of her brougham drawn up in the drive not 20 yards from their old meeting place. He could not be mistaken. He knew the horses well enough, and there was old Wallis on the box and young Wallis on the path. He stopped breathlessly and then tipped on cautiously, keeping the encircling line of bushes between him and the carriage. And then he saw through the leaves that there was some one in the place, and that it was she. He stopped confused and amazed. He could not comprehend it. She must have driven to the place immediately on his departure. But why? And why to that place of all others? He parted the bushes with his hands and saw her lovely and sweet looking as she had always been, standing under the box bush beside the bench and breaking off one of the green branches. The branch parted and the stem flew back to its place again, leaving a green sprig in her hand. She turned at that moment directly toward him, and he could see from his hiding place how she lifted the leaves to her lips, and that a tear was creeping down her cheek. Then he dashed the bushes aside with both arms and with a cry that no one but she heard, sprang toward her. Young Van Bibber stopped his mail phaeton in front of the club and went inside to recuperate, and told how he had seen them driving home through the park in her brougham and unchaperoned. "Which I call very bad form," said the punctilious Van Bibber, "even though they are engaged." End of A Walk Up the Avenue by Richard Harding Davis. Read by Lars Rolander.